My name is Claire Sterling. I am 34 years old. 10 years ago, my family cut me off. They called me dead weight, a financial drain, a burden they could no longer afford to carry. They packed my entire life into black garbage bags, tossed them onto the front porch in the dead of night, and told me to figure my own life out. They had absolutely no idea that the useless data entry clerk they threw away would go on to build a predictive risk assessment software. They had no idea I would build a company valued at $2.1 billion. And they certainly did not know that I was the anonymous CEO who had just quietly bought up every single defaulted mortgage their rotting real estate empire owed. Yesterday, they showed up at my corporate headquarters in downtown Seattle. They came to beg, not to apologize for abandoning me when I needed them most, but to demand that the anonymous billionaire save their sinking ship. They stood in my private lobby, straightening their designer clothes, completely unaware that I was watching them through the one-way glass of my penthouse office. I watched them practice their fabricated sob stories. But when I finally walked into that boardroom and placed a small digital audio recorder on the massive oak table, their desperate begging turned into dead absolute silence. Before I tell you exactly what was on that tape and how I stripped away their arrogance, take a second to hit like and subscribe if you believe greed always catches up with people. Drop a comment telling me what state you are watching from and what time it is right now. Let us get into it. I stood in the darkened observation room overlooking the executive lobby of Novus Analytics. The glass was heavily tinted. To anyone on the other side, it looked like a sleek black mirror. But from where I stood, the view was crystal clear. And the view was sickening. My father, Thomas, paced back and forth across the Italian marble floor. He wore his signature tailored navy suit, the one he always wore when he needed to project wealth he no longer possessed. He kept running a hand through his graying hair, muttering under his breath. Next to him, on the plush leather sofa, sat my mother, Susan. She was nervously twisting her diamond wedding band, her eyes darting around the expansive modern lobby, as if trying to calculate exactly how much money the anonymous owner of this building had. And then there was my younger sister, Chloe, the undisputed golden child of the Sterling family. She was scrolling through her phone, looking profoundly annoyed that she had to be there at all. Standing right beside her was her husband, Julian, the slick finance broker, who had managed to drive my father into the ground in record time. I pressed a button on the control panel near the window, activating the audio feed from the lobby security cameras. The room was equipped with high-definition microphones. I wanted to hear every single word they said while they waited for the mysterious CEO who held their financial lives in her hands. "Listen to me, Thomas," Julian said, his voice dripping with that unbearable arrogance I remembered so well. "You need to lead with the legacy angle. These tech billionaires love a good underdog story. Tell whoever runs this place that Sterling Real Estate is a cornerstone of traditional family values. Tell them we were blindsided by market shifts, not bad investments. Play up the honest, hard-working American family narrative. We just need them to restructure the $50 million debt and give us a 3-year grace period." My father stopped pacing and let out a shaky breath. He looked terrible. The years of trying to keep up appearances had taken a visible toll on his face. "Are you sure these asset valuations will hold up if their analysts look too closely?" my father asked. "If they dig into the commercial strip malls we leveraged last year, they will see the occupancy rates are completely faked. We are bleeding cash, Julian. If Novus decides to foreclose instead of restructure, we lose the house, the cars, everything." My mother stood up, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "Thomas, keep your voice down," she hissed, glancing nervously at the empty reception desk. "Julian knows what he is doing. He is a financial expert. We just need to sell the image. We are the Sterling family. We take care of our own. We support each other. That is the pitch. Family loyalty." I let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed in the empty observation room. Family loyalty. The hypocrisy was so thick I could practically taste it. They were standing in my building preparing to leverage the concept of family loyalty to save themselves from a financial disaster they created through pure greed. They wanted to preach about supporting each other entirely, forgetting the daughter they had discarded like trash the moment she became an inconvenience to their upper-class lifestyle. Chloe finally looked up from her phone, crossing her arms over her expensive silk blouse. "I cannot believe we even have to do this," she whined, tapping her foot in agitation. Julian, you promised we would be closing on the New Hampton summer house by next week. Now we are begging some faceless tech nerd for a handout. If I have to cancel my country club membership because you two mismanaged the accounts, I am going to lose my mind. I promise you, babe, Julian said, wrapping an arm around her waist and flashing a perfectly practiced smile. I have dealt with these Silicon Valley types before. They have too much money and zero street smarts. I will charm them, flash these projected revenue charts, and we will walk out of here with a clean slate. Trust me, they will never know what hit them. I leaned closer to this cold glass, my eyes locked on Julian as he smoothed his expensive tie. He thought he was walking into a room with a naive tech founder he could easily manipulate with fake spreadsheets and fake smiles. He thought his charm and my father using a fabricated legacy would act as a magic shield against the $50 million in defaulted loans they owed me. My assistant Sarah stepped quietly into the observation room behind me. They are getting impatient, Ma, she said softly. Should I tell them the CEO is ready to see them now? I kept my eyes on my family for one more moment. I watched my father practice his humble, honest businessman smile in the reflection of the glass, staring directly at me without knowing I was standing right there. The anger I thought I had buried 10 years ago flared in my chest, but it was cold, calculated, and entirely under my control. Not yet, I replied, my voice steady. Let them sweat for another 10 minutes. Let them rehearse their lies a little longer. When you bring them up to the VIP boardroom on the 50th floor, offer them sparkling water. Make them feel important. I want them feeling completely invincible, right up until the exact second I tear their world apart. The high-definition security feed illuminated my darkened penthouse office with a cold and clinical glow. I stood perfectly still with my arms crossed over my chest as I stared at the bank of flat-screen monitors mounted on the wall. The screens displayed every possible angle of the grand lobby of Novus Analytics down on the ground floor. My lobby. I had designed that space myself. I chose the towering walls of reinforced glass, the polished slate floors, and the massive pillars of dark steel. The entire ground floor of the building was engineered to intimidate anyone who walked through the revolving doors. It was built to make visitors immediately understand that they were stepping into a fortress of immense wealth and untouchable power. And right now, sitting directly in the center of that fortress, looking incredibly small and entirely out of place, was my biological family. It had been precisely 10 years since I last saw them in person. 10 years since I sat shivering on a dark porch in suburban Chicago, with my entire life packed into 2 black plastic garbage bags. Watching them now through the sterile lens of a security camera felt profoundly surreal. Time had aged my father, Thomas. The broad shoulders that used to carry an air of absolute authority in our household now slumped beneath the crushing weight of his failing commercial real estate empire. He was wearing his best tailored charcoal suit, but it hung loosely on his frame. It was a physical manifestation of the $50 million debt he carried. He paced the slate floor like a trapped animal, nervously checking his gold watch. He was completely unaware that the anonymous tech chief executive officer he was so desperate to meet was the exact same daughter he had thrown away like trash. My mother, Susan, sat perfectly upright on one of the imported leather sofas. She had always treated her public appearance like a weapon, and today in Seattle was no different. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her makeup was completely flawless, and her designer handbag was clutched tightly in her lap like a protective shield. But the high-definition cameras were unforgiving. They captured the fine lines of pure panic around her eyes and the tight, rigid set of her jaw. She was terrified. They were all terrified because their entire world was on the brink of total collapse. And then there was Chloe, my older sister, the golden child of the Sterling family who had never been told the word no in her entire 36 years of life. She was pacing near the front reception desk, wearing a pristine white silk blouse and tapping her manicured nails impatiently against her expensive phone. She looked exactly as I remembered her, beautiful, constantly irritated, and utterly consumed by her own entitlement. Standing right beside her was her husband, Julian. Julian was the slick, fast-talking finance broker who had managed to completely gut my father's company from the inside out in just 5 short years. He was the primary reason they were currently facing total financial ruin. Yet he stood there with his hands in his pockets, leaning casually against a steel pillar and exuding a nauseating level of unearned confidence. I reached forward and pressed a small button on the brushed aluminum control panel sitting on my desk. The audio feed from the lobby microphones instantly crackled to life, filling my quiet office with their voices. The sound of them hit me like a physical blow. It was a sudden and violent rush of the past colliding directly with the present. "You need to stop pacing right now," Thomas Julian was saying. His voice was smooth, patronizing, and dripping with the kind of arrogance only a man playing with someone else's money could possess. "You are going to sweat completely through your suit before they even call us upstairs to the boardroom. You need to look like a man who is in control of his business, not a man who is begging for his life." My father stopped pacing near a modern water sculpture and turned to Julian. His face was pale and strained with exhaustion. "How exactly am I supposed to look like I'm in control, Julian? We are $50 million in the red. The bank sent the final foreclosure notices on Tuesday morning. We have less than a week before they seize the commercial properties, the house, the cars, everything we own. If this Novus Analytics executive decides to liquidate our debt instead of restructuring it, I am going to lose the company my grandfather built. I am going to lose absolutely everything." Julian let out a short, dismissive laugh that made my blood run cold. "You are not going to lose anything, Tom. You just need to follow the script I gave you on the flight over here. These Silicon Valley tech billionaires are all exactly the same. They sit up in their glass towers running predictive algorithms, but they do not actually know how the real world works. They do not understand the art of the deal. They run their companies on raw data, but they buy into emotion. You are going to walk into that boardroom today, and you are going to sell them the legacy angle." "What legacy angle?" my father asked, his voice trembling slightly as he wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. "They have our entire financial portfolio. They know we are failing. The numbers do not lie." "They only know what the numbers say," Julian replied smoothly. He stepped closer to my father and lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, but the sensitive microphones picked up every single syllable. "And numbers can be contextualized. We tell them that sterling real estate is a victim of sudden macroeconomic shifts, not bad management. We tell them that we are a deeply rooted traditional family business built on loyalty and mutual support. We sell them the image of the honest, hardworking American family that just needs a temporary lifeline to weather a difficult storm. You look that anonymous chief executive officer right in the eye, and you tell them that family values are the absolute core of our business model. You tell them we take care of our own, and that is why our company deserves to survive." Up in my penthouse, I gripped the edge of my desk so tightly my knuckles turned white. Family values, loyalty, mutual support. The sheer unadulterated hypocrisy of those words coming from their mouths made my stomach turn completely upside down. They were standing in the lobby of my building preparing to leverage the concept of family devotion as a bargaining chip to save themselves from a financial disaster they had created through pure greed. They were planning to preach about taking care of their own, entirely forgetting the daughter they had discarded the moment she became a financial inconvenience to their upper-class lifestyle. My mother chimed in then. Her voice carried that familiar sharp tone of absolute authority that used to make me shrink into myself when I was a teenager. "Julian is exactly right, Thomas. You cannot walk in there looking defeated. We are the Sterling family. We have a reputation to uphold in this community, and we will not be humiliated. We just need to convince them to give us a 3-year grace period on the interest payments. Once the commercial real estate market bounces back, Julian can flip those retail spaces and we will be fine. You just have to play the part of the devoted patriarch. Make them feel sorry for you. Make them respect you for you." Chloe sighed loudly, dramatically, throwing her hands up in the air and looking toward the ceiling. "I cannot believe we are even in Seattle right now doing this," she complained. Her voice echoed shrilly in the cavernous lobby. "Julian, you promised me we would be closing on the New Hampton summer house by next week. You promised me we were going to upgrade the country club membership so we could host the charity gala. Now I am standing in some sterile tech building, begging a computer company not to take my house away. If my friends find out about this, I will be completely ruined socially. I will be an absolute laughingstock." Julian moved to Chloe's side and wrapped a reassuring arm around her shoulders. He kissed the side of her head, playing the role of the devoted husband perfectly for his audience of 2. "Relax, babe," he murmured, projecting an aura of total control. "I promise you we are not losing the house. We are not losing the country club. I have doctored the occupancy reports for the retail strip malls. I padded the projected revenue for the next 4 quarters so the margins look stable. When this tech nerd looks at our files, they will see a portfolio that is just temporarily underperforming, not a portfolio that is fundamentally dead. I have dealt with these people before. They are socially awkward shut-ins who hide behind computer screens and code. I will charm them, I will flash a few complicated financial terms to confuse them, and they will sign the restructuring agreement without ever looking closely at the fraudulent numbers. We will walk out of here with $50 million in breathing room, and they will never even know they got played. I stood completely frozen in my office. I was listening to the man who was actively destroying my family, proudly confess to doctoring official financial reports and committing outright federal wire fraud. He was laying out his entire criminal strategy on a silver platter. He was entirely unaware that he was speaking directly into the high-definition security microphones of the most advanced financial risk assessment firm in the entire country. He thought he was so incredibly smart. He thought he was untouchable. He thought my company was run by a naive, gullible fool he could easily swindle with fake spreadsheets. But what was infinitely more sickening than Julian's blatant criminality was the reaction of my own parents. They did not reprimand him. They did not express shock or outrage that their son-in-law had falsified official commercial documents. They did not show an ounce of moral hesitation. Instead, my father visibly relaxed. His tense shoulders dropped as he absorbed Julian's criminal reassurances. My mother nodded approvingly, patting her designer handbag and offering Julian a small, grateful smile. They were perfectly willing to break the law. They were perfectly willing to lie, cheat, and steal to maintain their illusion of wealth and superiority. They were the exact same people they had been 10 years ago. Time had not softened them. Impending financial hardship had not humbled them. They were still driven by the exact same toxic vanity and ruthless self-interest that had allowed them to look a young woman in the face and tell her she was nothing but a useless burden. Listening to them rehearse their pathetic, fabricated sob story about family loyalty, something deep inside my chest cracked open. I closed my eyes, and suddenly, I was no longer standing in a multi-million-dollar corporate penthouse overlooking the Seattle skyline. The polished glass walls and expensive leather furniture vanished. Suddenly, I was back in the past. I was 24 years old again. It was a suffocatingly hot summer evening in Chicago. The air in the hospital emergency room was thick and heavy with the smell of antiseptic and my own fear. I was lying in a sterile hospital bed, clutching a thin blanket with sweaty, trembling hands, listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor. It was the night that was supposed to be my breaking point. It was the night I finally understood the true cost of their so-called family values. Growing up in the affluent, meticulously manicured suburbs of Chicago, I learned very early that love in the Sterling household was a finite, heavily guarded resource. It was a highly specific currency handed out based on a strict and unforgiving ranking system, and I was perpetually stationed at the absolute bottom of the ledger. My older sister, Chloe, was the undisputed star of our family. She was effortlessly beautiful, socially adept, and possessed this magnetic, charming quality that made my parents absolutely light up whenever she walked into a room. From the time she was 12 years old, my mother, Susan, groomed her for one specific and highly calculated purpose. Chloe was going to marry into Wall Street wealth. That was her job, and my parents poured every ounce of their energy, attention, and spare capital into securing her glittering future. They paid for exclusive country club memberships we could barely afford just so Chloe could mingle with the right crowd. They bought her endless designer wardrobes, sent her on luxurious weekend retreats to the Hamptons, and enrolled her in expensive etiquette classes. They wanted her to look the part, to act the part, and to seamlessly blend into the upper crust of society. Chloe was their masterpiece, their ultimate financial and social investment. And then there was me. I was the practical daughter, the plain invisible second child who vastly preferred the quiet, predictable logic of numbers over the exhausting fake theater of high society networking. When I told my father, Thomas, that I wanted to study finance and accounting at a local state university, he simply nodded, barely looking up from his morning newspaper, and called it a useful skill. I did not realize then that he meant it would be exclusively useful for him. While Chloe was off attending charity galas and securing her future with investment bankers, I was buried under mountains of ledger books in the dusty windowless back office of Sterling Real Estate. My father's commercial property company was aging stubbornly, refusing to adapt to the modern era, and his bookkeeping system was a chaotic, disastrous mess of loose paper receipts and severely outdated spreadsheets. By the time I was 20 years old, I was effectively running the entire financial back end of his business. I organized his chaotic accounts, managed the complex payroll for his disgruntled contractors, reconciled his quarterly taxes, and desperately tried to balance books that were constantly bleeding cash due to his poor management. I covered up his late payments, negotiated with angry vendors, and kept the lights on when he spent company money on Chloe's lavish lifestyle. And I did every single bit of it for free. I told myself I was doing my part to help the family. I naively believed that if I just worked hard enough, if I proved exactly how reliable and indispensable I was to his survival, my parents would eventually look at me with the same glowing pride they reserved for Chloe. I accepted the discarded hand-me-down clothes without a single complaint. I drove a 10-year-old rust-covered sedan that barely started in the bitter Chicago winters. I lived in a cramped, drafty, one-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city, constantly justifying my personal sacrifices as a necessary down payment on my parents' affection. I truly thought my relentless, quiet loyalty would eventually earn me a legitimate seat at their table. That foolish illusion shattered permanently 10 years ago. I was 24 years old, physically exhausted, and desperately trying to keep my father's sinking real estate company afloat during a brutal financial quarter. It was late November, and the punishing Chicago winter had arrived weeks early, bringing with it a blinding, violent sleet storm that paralyzed the city. My father had called me in an absolute panic that Friday afternoon. He had carelessly forgotten to deliver a stack of highly critical physical contracts to an out-of-town investor across the city. The investor was leaving the country the very next morning, and my father told me the entire fourth quarter revenue depended entirely on those specific signatures. He did not ask if I was busy. He did not ask if I felt safe driving my unreliable car in the freezing, treacherous rain. He simply told me to get it done immediately or the company would fold, because that was my assigned role in the Sterling family. I was the reliable beast of burden expected to carry the heavy weight whenever they carelessly dropped it. I wrapped myself in my cheap, thin winter coat, grabbed the thick manila folder of commercial contracts, and climbed into my freezing sedan. The city roads were a treacherous, terrifying sheet of black ice. The sleet was coming down so hard that visibility was practically zero, turning the streetlights into blurry, smeared halos. I drove agonizingly slowly, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached with the immense strain. I made it safely through the worst of the downtown traffic and was turning onto a major multi-lane intersection when my entire world abruptly ended. I never even saw the massive commercial delivery truck that ran the red light. The impact was absolutely deafening. It sounded like a bomb detonating directly inside the small cabin of my car. The immense crushing force of the collision slammed violently into my driver's side door, crumpling the heavy metal inward like a fragile tin can and shattering the windows into a million jagged flying pieces. My small car spun wildly and uncontrollably across the icy pavement, the tires screeching against the asphalt before violently slamming into a solid concrete barrier. The world turned upside down in a terrifying blur of screaming metal and shattered glass. In that final fraction of a second before everything went black, my only panicked thought was that my father's contracts were ruined. And then there was only darkness. When I finally forced my heavy, swollen eyes open, the blinding, sterile glare of fluorescent hospital lights stabbed sharply at my retinas. The overwhelming, nauseating smell of strong chemical antiseptic and metallic blood filled my lungs, making me gag. I tried to shift my weight, but an agonizing, white-hot pain ripped through my chest and shot down my left leg, stealing the breath from my lungs. I gasped aloud, choking on the dry, recycled hospital air. A nurse immediately rushed over to my bedside, gently but firmly pressing a hand to my shoulder to keep me perfectly still. She told me I was in the emergency trauma center. She said I was incredibly lucky to be alive. My leg was shattered in 3 separate places, my ribs were heavily fractured, and I had severe life-threatening internal bleeding. I lay there, shivering violently under a thin, scratchy hospital blanket, listening to the chaotic symphony of medical machines beeping urgently around me. I had never felt so incredibly small, so physically broken, and so utterly terrified in my entire life. An emergency room trauma surgeon quickly approached my bed. He had deep, dark circles under his eyes and a grim, deeply serious expression on his face. He explained the severe extent of my injuries with cold clinical precision. The internal bleeding was currently being managed by the trauma team, but my left leg was a catastrophic, complicated mess. The bone was badly splintered, and without immediate, highly specialized bone graft surgery, I risked severe and permanent nerve damage. He looked me right in the eye and told me I could lose the ability to walk properly for the rest of my life. He said they needed to operate immediately to save the leg. I nodded, weakly, tears of pure, unadulterated agony streaming down my face, begging them to just fix it. But then, a hospital financial administrator stepped into the small, crowded, curtained area, holding a clipboard like it was a weapon. She looked down at me with a sickening mixture of corporate pity and administrative coldness. She explained that my basic health insurance policy considered the complex bone graft an out-of-network experimental procedure. It was the cheap, bare-bones policy I paid for completely out of my own meager savings because my father had flatly refused to put me on the sterling real estate company plan. He had claimed it was too expensive to add me, even though I worked 50 grueling hours a week for him for free. The insurance company flatly refused to cover the specialized operation. The administrator stated that the hospital required a $15,000 upfront copay to proceed with the surgery. $15,000. The number echoed loudly in my throbbing head like a cruel, twisted joke. I was a 24-year-old unpaid bookkeeper living paycheck to paycheck in a terrible apartment. I had barely $1,000 to my name in my checking account. I had spent all my time, all my energy, and all my youth working for free to keep my father's business alive so he could continue funding Chloe's lavish, untouchable lifestyle. I had absolutely nothing left for myself. I had poured my entire existence into an empty well. The strong pain medication they had given me in the ambulance was rapidly starting to wear off, and the physical agony in my shattered leg was becoming completely unbearable. The trauma surgeon stepped forward again, warning me that time was quickly running out. Every single hour we delayed the operation significantly increased the risk of irreversible permanent damage to my mobility. I lay helplessly in that sterile hospital bed, my heart hammering violently against my fractured ribs. I had no hidden savings. I had no credit cards with that kind of available limit. I had no wealthy friends to bail me out of a medical crisis. I had absolutely no one else to turn to but the people who had brought me into this world. I had dedicated my entire adult life to serving my family. I had sacrificed my own financial stability, my own career prospects, and my own youth to ensure my father's commercial real estate business survived. I knew his accounts intimately. I knew exactly how much money he had in the bank. I had personally saved him hundreds of thousands of dollars in accounting fees over the years. $15,000 was absolutely nothing to them. It was a fraction of what they spent on Chloe's designer wardrobe every single season. It was less than what they spent catering one of their lavish summer parties at the country club. Surely, I thought in my naive, desperate and terrified mind. Surely they would help me now. I was their daughter. I was bleeding in a hospital bed. I was facing permanent physical disability. They had to care. They had to show up. They had to realize that my life was worth at least $15,000. I reached for my cracked cell phone with trembling, blood-stained fingers. Every tiny movement sent a fresh, blinding wave of agony shooting through my broken body. I stared at the illuminated screen, my vision blurring heavily with tears of pain and mounting fear. I pulled up my mother's contact information. I just needed my family. I just needed them to answer the phone to tell me they were coming to show up for me just this once in my entire life. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear, listening to it ring, praying for a voice on the other end. I held my cracked cell phone to my ear with a hand that simply would not stop shaking. The sterile, brightly lit hospital room around me seemed to fade into a dull, agonizing hum as I listened to the steady, repetitive tone of the phone ringing. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. 4. Then the automated voice of my father clicking on. He had sent me straight to voicemail. A sharp, terrifying spike of pure panic pierced through the heavy fog of the pain medication that was trying to cloud my brain. I quickly disconnected the call, my breathing turning ragged and shallow as the pain in my shattered leg flared up again. I wiped a mixture of sweat and drying blood from my forehead and dialed my mother. My fingers were slick and clumsy, making the cracked glass screen difficult to navigate. I pressed the phone against my cheek, closing my eyes tightly against the blinding fluorescent lights overhead. "Please, pick up," I whispered into the quiet trauma bay. "Please, just this once." Answer the phone. The line rang twice before the sound abruptly cut off. Call declined. I lowered the phone and stared at the screen in absolute disbelief. The financial administrator was still standing at the foot of my bed. Her arms crossed over her clipboard, tapping her pen against the plastic with a profound lack of patience. The trauma surgeon was pacing near the curtain, checking the wall clock every 30 seconds. My internal bleeding was stabilized, but my leg was dying. Every single minute that ticked by without that $15,000 copay meant another step closer to permanent, irreversible nerve damage. I swallowed hard, tasting copper in the back of my throat. I opened my text messages, my fingers trembling so violently I could barely type. I opened the family group chat. It was a chat they usually only used to coordinate Chloe's dress fittings and country club dinners, a chat I was almost never included in. "I am in the emergency room." I typed the words, blurring through my tears. I was in a bad accident running the contract delivery. My leg is shattered. The hospital needs $15,000 up front for a bone graft, or I might never walk right again. Insurance denied it. Please help me. I am so scared. I hit send. I watched the little notification at the bottom of the screen shift from delivered to read. I waited. I watched the 3 small gray dots appear on the screen, indicating that someone was typing a response. My heart hammered violently against my fractured ribs. I let out a long, shaky breath of relief. They were going to help. They had read it, and they were going to help me. They had to. I was their daughter. I was lying in a hospital bed, broken and terrified. The gray dots vanished. A new message popped up on the screen. It was from my mother. I stared at the glowing letters, reading them once, twice, 3 times, desperately trying to force my brain to process the absolute cruelty of the words arranged before me. "We are funding Chloe's Hampton's wedding right now," the text read. "We simply do not have the liquid cash for this kind of dramatic emergency. You have always been a financial drain and a burden on this family, Claire. We warned you about driving that unreliable junk car in the winter. We cannot jeopardize Chloe's future to fix your mistakes. Figure this out yourself. Figure this out yourself." I stared at the screen until the backlight timed out and the glass faded to black. The phone slipped from my numb, trembling fingers and clattered onto the thin hospital blanket. The financial administrator sighed loudly, stepping closer to my bed. "Well," she said, her voice entirely devoid of basic human empathy, "do you have a secondary payment method, or should I inform the surgeon that you are declining the specialized graft?" I looked up at her, my vision completely blurred by tears that were no longer born from physical pain, but from a profound soul-crushing heartbreak. I realized in that exact second that my parents were perfectly willing to let me become permanently disabled rather than sacrifice a single floral arrangement at my sister's society wedding. They were choosing a party in the Hamptons over my physical body. I took a deep, agonizing breath, burying the terrified 13-year-old girl inside me who still somehow believed her parents loved her. "Give me the financial hardship forms," I told the administrator, my voice cracking, but suddenly possessing a very cold, hollow edge. "I will sign whatever predatory high-interest medical debt agreements you have. Just tell the surgeon to save my leg." The next 7 days were a waking nightmare of morphine-aggressive physical therapy and crushing isolation. I underwent the bone graft surgery. When I woke up, my left leg was encased in a massive, heavy cast from my thigh down to my toes. Not a single person came to visit me. Not a single flower delivery arrived. My phone remained entirely silent. No text messages checking to see if I survived the operation. No voicemails asking if I was in pain. I spent a week lying in that hospital bed staring at the ceiling, calculating the terrifying reality of the massive 6-figure medical debt I had just chained to my own name. I was 24 years old, making $12 an hour doing unpaid bookkeeping for my father, and I was utterly ruined. When the hospital finally discharged me on a freezing Tuesday morning, I had to use a portion of my meager remaining bank balance to hire a medical transport taxi. I hobbled out of the hospital, sliding doors on a pair of heavy aluminum crutches every single step, sending a shockwave of fiery pain up my hip and into my spine. The Chicago winter wind cut right through my thin jacket. The cab driver dropped me off at the end of the long, winding driveway of my parents' suburban estate. He refused to drive up to the front door because the pavement was completely covered in a thick sheet of dangerous, untreated black ice. I stood at the end of the driveway, leaning heavily on my crutches, shivering violently in the biting cold. The grand two-story colonial house loomed in front of me, its windows glowing with warm, inviting light. It looked like the perfect picture of an affluent, happy American family. I gritted my teeth, ignoring the agonizing burning sensation in my newly grafted bone, and began the slow, torturous climb up the icy driveway. It took me 20 minutes to cover a distance that normally took 30 seconds. By the time I reached the wide wraparound front porch, my heavy cast was soaked with melting snow, and fresh bright red blood was beginning to seep through the white surgical bandages on my thighs, staining my jeans. I reached out a freezing, trembling hand to turn the brass doorknob. It was locked. I frowned, leaning my weight onto my right crutch, and reached into my pocket for my house key. That was when I saw them. Sitting in the darkest corner of the expansive porch, completely covered in a fresh dusting layer of white snow, were two enormous black plastic garbage bags. My old worn-out winter boots were sitting neatly on top of one of the bags. My cheap second-hand winter coat was draped carelessly over the other. My breath caught in my throat, forming a white cloud of vapor in the freezing air. I hobbled over to the bags and prodded one with the rubber tip of my crutch. It split open slightly, revealing the familiar spines of my college accounting textbooks, a stack of my folded sweaters, and the small-framed photograph of my late grandmother I kept on my nightstand. They had packed up my entire life. They had stripped my room bare and thrown my existence out into the freezing snow like yesterday's trash. I did not scream. I did not cry. The sheer breathtaking magnitude of their betrayal had pushed me entirely past the capacity for normal human emotion. I balanced heavily on my crutches and reached over to ring the doorbell. I rang it once, twice, 3 times. Finally, the heavy oak door opened. My father stood in the doorway. He was wearing a warm cashmere sweater and holding a crystal glass of expensive scotch. He did not open the door all the way. He kept his body positioned in the gap, acting as a physical barrier between the freezing cold porch and the warm golden light of the foyer behind him. He looked down at my massive cast, at the aluminum crutches digging into my armpits, at the fresh blood soaking through my jeans, and at the shivering, broken body of his youngest daughter. His expression did not soften. There was absolutely zero warmth in his eyes. He looked at me with the exact same cold, calculated irritation he used when dealing with a tenant who was late on their commercial rent. "What are you doing here, Claire?" he asked, taking a slow sip of his scotch. "Your mother told you to figure your own situation out." I looked up at him, my teeth chattering so hard my jaw physically ached. "You packed up my room," I said, my voice barely more than a hoarse, freezing whisper. "Where am I supposed to go? I just had major surgery. I cannot walk. I have nowhere to sleep." "That is not my problem anymore," my father said flatly. His voice was completely devoid of any paternal affection. "You provide zero value to this family, Claire. You are a financial liability and a constant source of stress. Your sister is marrying into the Julian family next month. Do you have any idea how important the Julian family is to my business network? They are Wall Street royalty. We are hosting a massive engagement dinner for them here this weekend, and we simply cannot have you hobbling around the house looking miserable and complaining about your medical bills. You're an embarrassment to Chloe's new, wealthy in-laws. You're a bad look for this family." I stared at him. The freezing wind whipped my hair across my face, stinging my cheeks. "You are kicking me out in the middle of winter, bleeding on crutches, because I'm an embarrassment to Chloe's rich boyfriend?" I asked, needing to hear him confirm the absolute unvarnished truth. "I am asking you to leave because you are dead weight," my father corrected coldly. "We have spent thousands of dollars putting a roof over your head, and what do we get in return? A A daughter who causes accidents, incurs massive debt, and expects us to bail her out. We are done carrying you. The bags have everything you own. Do not come back and disturb your mother. She is very stressed about the wedding preparations." He did not wait for a response. He simply stepped back and firmly closed the heavy oak door. I heard the deadbolt click into place, the final echoing sound of my family locking me out of their lives forever. I stood alone on that freezing porch for what felt like an eternity. The porch light clicked off, plunging me into complete and utter darkness. The snow was falling harder now, covering the black garbage bags, covering my boots, covering my bleeding leg. The physical pain in my body was completely agonizing, a constant screaming fire that threatened to pull me down into unconsciousness. But as I stood there in the bitter cold, staring at the locked door of the house I grew up in, the tears completely stopped falling. The profound, crushing weight of my lifelong desperation finally evaporated. For 24 years, I had bent myself into 1,000 different shapes, trying to earn a single scrap of their conditional love. I had done their accounting for free. I had worn my sister's cast-offs. I had accepted the smallest, quietest corner of their world, believing that if I was just useful enough, they would eventually value me. But they had just proven with absolute brutal clarity that my utility to them was entirely worthless the moment I needed something in return. I was not a daughter. I was a disposable asset. And they had just finalized the write-off. I reached down with a freezing hand, grabbed the thick plastic drawstrings of the 2 heavy garbage bags and looped them awkwardly over the handles of my crutches. Every tiny movement tore a fresh scream of pain from my shattered leg, but I forced my jaw shut. I turned my back on the grand colonial house, on the warm, golden windows, on the people who had brought me into this world, only to throw me away. I began the agonizingly slow, deeply painful journey back down the icy driveway toward the dark, empty street. With every single agonizing step I took in the freezing Chicago snow, my blood leaving a faint, dark trail on the white ice behind me, the heartbreak was slowly bleeding out of my system. And in its place, something entirely new was beginning to take root. It was a cold, sharp, and brutally precise instinct for pure survival. I realized in the darkness that my parents had not just thrown me out. They had fundamentally freed me. By severing the heavy, toxic anchor of their conditional love, they had given me the absolute permission to stop working for their survival and to start fighting relentlessly for my own. I walked away from my family that night, carrying immense physical pain and a mountain of crushing medical debt. But as I limped into the freezing darkness, my mind was already racing, calculating, and planning. I knew exactly how my father's business operated. I knew exactly how he hid his failing margins. I knew the numbers. I knew the data, and I knew exactly how to use it. The scared, invisible daughter died on that icy driveway. The architect of a billion-dollar empire was just taking her very first agonizing step. I boarded a westbound bus the very morning after my family locked me out in the freezing snow. I had 2 black garbage bags of cheap belongings, a cast that enveloped my entire left leg, and a staggering amount of high-interest medical debt attached to my name. I chose Seattle simply because it was as far away from the toxic, suffocating wealth of suburban Chicago as my meager bank account could take me. The physical journey across the country was pure agony. Every bump in the highway sent a fresh shockwave of fire through my healing bones, but I welcomed the pain. It kept me entirely awake. It kept me sharply focused. It reminded me that the people who were supposed to protect me had chosen to let me bleed, and I would never ever put my survival in the hands of another human being again. The first 2 years in Washington State were a brutal, relentless grind just to stay alive. I rented a tiny, windowless basement room in a crumbling house shared with 4 loud university students. Because I could not stand for long periods without my leg throbbing violently, I took on multiple low-paying remote data entry jobs. I spent 18 hours a day sitting at a cheap plastic folding table, staring at endless rows of numbers on a pawn shop laptop. I processed invoices, reconciled bank statements, and balanced the books for dozens of small regional businesses. I ate cheap instant noodles for almost every single meal. I did my own grueling physical therapy on the damp carpet of my bedroom because I could not afford to see a specialist. But as I sat there, day after day, digging through the financial records of various commercial real estate firms across the Pacific Northwest, my mind kept returning to the dusty, chaotic back office of Sterling Real Estate. I thought about the thousands of unpaid hours I had spent trying to fix my father's broken accounting system. I realized very quickly that my father was not unique in his deception. The commercial real estate industry was absolutely crawling with arrogant men who used the exact same dirty, manipulative tricks to hide their toxic assets from the banks. I knew exactly where they buried the bodies. I knew how they artificially inflated their property values by creating fake shell companies to sign dummy leases, making empty strip malls look fully occupied to secure massive multi-million-dollar refinancing loans. I knew how they illegally capitalized basic everyday maintenance costs to artificially boost their net operating income on paper. I knew how they shifted terrible defaulting debt between different limited liability companies to confuse human auditors. They relied entirely on the fact that the analysts at the megabanks were overworked, underpaid, and too exhausted to cross-reference thousands of pages of dense, boring property data. Human eyes could easily be tricked by a slick presentation and a confident smile. My father and my brother-in-law Julian had built their entire fraudulent empire on that exact premise. I realized that if I could build a system that possessed my intimate insider knowledge of commercial real estate fraud, a system that did not get tired, did not get distracted, and could not be charmed by a man in an expensive suit, I could completely revolutionize the financial industry. I just needed the technical architecture to make it happen. I had the financial blueprint, but I did not know how to write the complex code required to process that massive volume of data. That is how I met David. He was a brilliant, incredibly introverted software engineer who spent his evenings typing furiously at the corner table of the cheap coffee shop down the street from my basement apartment. He was a genius with predictive machine learning algorithms, but he was struggling to find a practical, highly profitable application for his code. He had the engine, but he had no idea what kind of car to put it in. I approached his table one rainy Tuesday evening, ordered a black coffee I could barely afford, and handed him a detailed 30-page manifesto I had written by hand. I told him I knew exactly how the worst people in the corporate world hid their lies. I told him that if we trained his machine learning models to look for the specific hidden financial gaps I had, identified the negative spaces where the numbers magically stopped making logical sense, we could catch commercial mortgage fraud before it ever happened. I pitched him the blueprint for Novus Analytics. David read the entire document right there in the coffee shop. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes were wide with absolute shock and pure adrenaline. He agreed to a 50-50 partnership on the spot. We spent the next 3 years working in absolute grinding obscurity. We operated out of a cramped, unheated garage David rented in the industrial district. We lived on cheap coffee, sheer stubborn willpower, and a shared obsession with building something perfectly impenetrable. I became the architect of the system. I fed the developing artificial intelligence every single dirty accounting trick I had ever watched my father use. I taught the software how to flag suspicious patterns in utility usage that contradicted stated occupancy rates. I trained the algorithm to detect identical corporate officers hiding behind slightly varied shell company names. I essentially took all the trauma, all the rejection, and all the quiet, observant years I had spent being treated like invisible furniture by my family, and I weaponized it into thousands of lines of relentless, unforgiving code. When we finally had a working prototype, we managed to secure a 10-minute pitch meeting with the chief risk officer of a mid-sized regional bank that had recently lost millions on a bad commercial loan. The executives in the room looked at me with the exact same dismissive, patronizing expressions my father used to give me. They saw a plain young woman in a cheap suit and assumed I was entirely out of my depth. But then I asked them to run our software on a sample of their current supposedly pristine commercial loan portfolio. The Novus Analytics algorithm processed 10,000 pages of dense financial data in less than 4 minutes. It instantly flagged 3 massive commercial loans as highly critical risks, highlighting a complex, deeply hidden web of phantom tenants and artificially inflated revenue projections that their human audit team had completely missed. The chief risk officer went completely pale. Our software had just saved his bank from a catastrophic $90 million default. The growth of Novus Analytics after that single meeting was nothing short of explosive. Word spread through the financial sector like wildfire. The banking industry was terrified of another major market crash, and suddenly, two unknown kids in Seattle had built a machine that could see right through the lies of arrogant commercial developers. Within 18 months, we signed exclusive multi-million-dollar enterprise contracts with four of the largest mega banks in the United States. They integrated our software directly into their institutional lending protocols. If you wanted a commercial loan over $10 million anywhere in the country, your financial history had to survive the Novus Analytics algorithm first. We secured our Series A funding with a valuation of $50 million. 2 years later, our Series B funding pushed the company valuation to $400 million. By the time I turned 33, Novus Analytics was dominating the global risk assessment market, and the company hit a certified valuation of $2.1 billion. I was a billionaire. The daughter who had been thrown onto a freezing porch with her belongings in garbage bags now controlled an empire that dictated the flow of capital across the entire country. I bought a sprawling, magnificent corporate headquarters in downtown Seattle. I hired hundreds of brilliant analysts and engineers. I paid off every single cent of my old medical debt in one single deeply satisfying transaction. I walked perfectly without a limp, the expensive physical therapy having completely restored my shattered leg. I had won the ultimate victory. But despite the massive wealth and the overwhelming industry success, I made a very strict, non-negotiable decision regarding my public profile. I remained completely and entirely anonymous. I scrubbed my name from all public-facing corporate documents. I utilized a complex network of blind trusts and holding companies to obscure my status as the majority shareholder and chief executive officer of Novus Analytics. Whenever a major financial magazine or news network wanted to do a cover story on the meteoric rise of the company, I sent David to do the interviews. David became the famous, brilliant face of the enterprise, smiling for the cameras and accepting the industry awards while I remained the invisible architect operating from the shadows of my 50th floor penthouse office. My board of directors and my public relations team constantly argued with me about this decision. They told me that the media would absolutely love my story. The narrative of a young woman rising from poverty and a devastating injury to build a billion-dollar tech giant was a public relations goldmine. They begged me to step into the spotlight and claim my rightful glory. But they did not understand the psychology of the people who shared my blood. I knew exactly how my mother and father operated. I knew that if they ever saw my face on the cover of a major business magazine, they would never feel an ounce of genuine remorse or shame for abandoning me. Instead, they would immediately attempt to rewrite history. My mother would proudly tell all her wealthy country club friends that her tough love was the exact reason I became so successful. My father would try to claim credit for my financial genius, loudly boasting that I learned everything I knew from working in his office. They would completely hijack my triumph, twisting my agonizing survival story into a validation of their own cruel parenting. Furthermore, I knew that if Chloe and Julian realized I had unlimited capital, they would instantly come crawling out of the woodwork, demanding access to my wealth under the suffocating, manipulative guise of family loyalty. They would try to bleed me dry all over again, viewing my billion-dollar company as nothing more than their own personal ATM. I absolutely refused to give them that satisfaction. I refused to let them claim a single percentage of my victory. I wanted to build an impenetrable, towering fortress of wealth and power completely independently, so that if the day ever came when our paths crossed again, they would have absolutely no leverage over me. And I knew that day was coming. While I was building my empire on the West Coast, I kept a very quiet, very close eye on the Sterling real estate company back in Chicago. I monitored their public filings and their property acquisitions. I watched from afar as my father slowly handed the reins of his business over to Julian. I saw exactly what Julian was doing. He was aggressively expanding the company, using dangerous amounts of highly leveraged debt, buying up massive failing retail spaces, and attempting to flip them using the exact same fraudulent accounting tricks that the Novus Analytics algorithm was specifically designed to catch and destroy. Julian thought he was an absolute genius. He thought he was playing the market perfectly, securing massive loans based on doctored occupancy rates and inflated projections, completely unaware that the financial world had drastically changed while he was busy popping champagne at the country club. He did not know that the major banks he relied on for his survival were now using my software to evaluate his files. I sat in my penthouse office watching the data flow across my secure servers and waited with cold, absolute patience. I knew it was only a matter of time before Julian's reckless arrogance triggered a fatal alert in my system. I knew the algorithm I had built from the pain of my own rejection would eventually close its digital jaws around the very people who had thrown me away. I just had to remain completely invisible until the trap snapped shut. 5 years passed. 5 years of relentless focus and sleepless nights. I sat in my penthouse office on a rainy Tuesday morning in Seattle. The city below was covered in a thick gray fog, but inside my office, everything was illuminated by the crisp glow of multiple monitors. Novus Analytics was no longer just a struggling startup. It was a massive financial machine operating perfectly. Our artificial intelligence software was constantly processing millions of pages of commercial real estate data for the biggest banks in the country. It was specifically designed to catch the exact kind of financial lies my father used to tell. It looked for phantom tenants. It looked for manipulated maintenance costs. It searched for the invisible gaps where arrogant men tried to hide their toxic debt. For the most part, my days were spent reviewing high-level executive summaries. I rarely needed to look at individual flagged portfolios anymore because my team of analysts was brilliant. But on this particular Tuesday morning, a massive red alert flashed across my primary monitor. It was a Tier 1 critical warning. The algorithm had detected a catastrophic level of severe mortgage fraud in a portfolio valued at nearly $60 million. The fraud was so blatantly reckless that the software had automatically quarantined the file for immediate executive review. I set down my coffee mug and opened the digital folder. I started scrolling through the executive summary, reading the intricate details of the deception. The developer had created dozens of fake shell companies to sign dummy commercial leases. They were artificially inflating their occupancy rates to secure massive refinancing loans from a major national bank. They were taking that new loan money and funneling it right back into paying the interest on their older failing properties. It was a classic illegal pyramid scheme built entirely on brick and mortar. I scrolled down to find the name of the holding company. When my eyes landed on the legal registration, my entire body went completely cold. My hand froze over the computer mouse. The primary holding company was registered as Sterling Commercial Holdings. The original guarantor was Thomas Sterling, my father. I sat back in my heavy leather chair and stared at the screen. I could not pull my eyes away from the name. Sterling Commercial Holdings. I quickly bypassed the summary and dove directly into the raw data. I looked at the signatures on the fraudulent lease agreements. I looked at the names of the corporate officers managing the fake shell companies. My father had stepped back from the day-to-day operations. The primary signature on almost every single forged document belonged to Julian. My sister Chloe had married him 3 years after I was thrown out. Julian was now running the entire Sterling real estate empire, and he was driving it straight off a massive financial cliff. I spent the next 4 hours locked in my office, completely ignoring my schedule. I meticulously traced every single dollar Julian had borrowed and hidden. He was incredibly arrogant. His financial manipulation was sloppy and careless. He clearly believed that because he wore an expensive suit and played golf with regional bank managers, nobody would ever look closely at his spreadsheets. He thought he was untouchable. He was using the inflated loan money to fund my family's lavish lifestyle. I saw the massive corporate write-offs for a luxury summer house in the Hamptons. I saw the exorbitant monthly fees for their elite country club memberships disguised as corporate entertaining expenses. They had thrown me out onto a freezing porch when I was 13 years old because a $15,000 medical bill was a burden they simply could not afford. They told me I was a financial drain on the family. Yet here they were, illegally siphoning millions of dollars in fraudulent loans to pay for designer clothes and lavish vacations. They were committing massive federal wire fraud to pretend they were wealthy, while their actual business was rotting from the inside out. A sharp, bitter laugh escaped my throat. The sheer irony of the situation was almost suffocating. The useless, invisible daughter they had discarded like trash had literally built the exact machine that just caught them committing federal crimes. Standard operating procedure at Novus Analytics was very clear. When the algorithm flagged a Tier 1 fraud case of this magnitude, We were contractually obligated to immediately notify the issuing megabanks and forward the file directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The federal authorities would swoop in, freeze all the assets, and arrest the corporate officers. Julian and my father would have been in handcuffs by the end of the week. But as my finger hovered over the button to authorize the automated federal report, I stopped. Sending them to federal prison immediately felt too fast. It felt too impersonal. If the government seized their assets, they would just play the victim. My mother, Susan, would cry to her country club friends about government overreach. Chloe would claim they were unfairly targeted. They would never truly understand the absolute devastation of being entirely powerless, of having your entire life stripped away by someone who holds all the cards. I wanted them to feel the exact same terror and helplessness I felt when they locked me out in the winter snow. So, I broke my own protocol. I cancelled the automated federal report. I placed the sterling file into a highly restricted encrypted folder that only I could access. I picked up my secure phone and called my chief financial officer. I instructed him to immediately activate a private blind subsidiary fund we kept for discrete corporate acquisitions. I told him to contact the major banks holding the sterling real estate loans. I knew those banks were already getting nervous about the sterling accounts because the payments were consistently late. The banks hated holding toxic commercial debt. They preferred to quietly sell it off at a massive discount just to get the liability off their books before it defaulted completely. Through my anonymous subsidiary company, I made the banks an offer they could not possibly refuse. I offered to buy up every single cent of the Sterling family defaulted mortgage debt for pennies on the dollar in pure liquid cash. The banks were absolutely thrilled. They did not ask any questions about the buyer. They simply wanted the toxic assets gone. Within 72 hours, the massive transaction was completely finalized. The banks transferred all the loan deeds, all the commercial liens, and all the personal financial guarantees directly to my holding company. I sat in my penthouse office, holding the physical printed deeds in my hands. I ran my fingers over my father's signature on the original loan agreements. By purchasing their debt, I had effectively purchased my family. I owned the commercial properties. I owned the strip malls. I owned the mortgage on their grand suburban estate. I owned the cars they drove. I was no longer the discarded, unwanted child. I was their absolute sole proprietor. I had become their invisible executioner, and they had absolutely no idea that the sword hanging directly over their heads belonged to me. I waited exactly 2 weeks to let the reality of their situation fully mature. I wanted Julian to feel the walls closing in. I wanted him to exhaust every single favor, every single line of credit, and every single wealthy friend he had. I wanted them completely isolated and utterly desperate. When the timing was absolutely perfect, I instructed my legal department to strike. We issued the official notice of immediate commercial default. We bypassed the standard warning letters and went straight to the final foreclosure declaration. The legal documents informed Sterling Real Estate that their previous banking partners had sold their debt to a private equity firm managed by Novus Analytics. The documents clearly stated that due to severe breach of contract, the entire $50 million balance was due immediately in full. If they failed to pay within 7 business days, we would seize the commercial portfolio, the family estate, and initiate forced bankruptcy proceedings. I can only imagine the sheer absolute panic that erupted in the Sterling household when that certified letter arrived. I pictured my father clutching his chest in his home office. I pictured my mother realizing her country club lifestyle was evaporating into thin air. I pictured Julian frantically dialing his old banking contacts, only to be told that his debt was no longer their problem. The response was almost immediate. Exactly 4 hours after the foreclosure notice was delivered, my secure executive email inbox pinged with an incoming message. It was from Julian. The subject line was marked Urgent Confidential Restructuring Proposal. I opened the email and read the pathetic, desperate words. Julian was writing to the anonymous chief executive officer of Novus Analytics. He completely abandoned his usual arrogant tone. The email was a masterclass in groveling. He claimed there had been a terrible misunderstanding regarding their financial health. He wrote that the Sterling family was a pillar of the community built on strong moral values and unwavering family loyalty. He literally used the words family loyalty. He begged for a brief face-to-face meeting in Seattle to present a new restructuring plan. He promised that if the CEO would just give them 30 minutes of their time, he could prove that their business was worth saving. I stared at the words, family loyalty, glowing on my computer screen. A cold, deeply satisfying smile spread slowly across my face. They wanted to use family loyalty to save themselves. They wanted to look their invisible debt holder in the eye and plead for mercy. I replied to his email with a single brief sentence. The executive board will see you this Friday at 2 in the afternoon at our Seattle headquarters. I closed my laptop and stood up, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. I had set the trap perfectly. They were going to spend the next 3 days scrambling to put together fake financial presentations and practicing their fabricated sob stories. They were going to fly across the country, desperately hoping to manipulate a faceless tech executive. They were walking completely blindly, right into the center of my web. The long, agonizing wait was finally over. The invisible daughter they had thrown away was about to welcome them to her empire. And the collision course, leading directly to that Friday afternoon in my corporate lobby, had officially begun. The high-definition security feed illuminated my darkened penthouse office with a cold and clinical glow. I stood perfectly still with my arms crossed over my chest as I stared at the bank of flat-screen monitors mounted on the wall. The screens displayed every possible angle of the grand lobby of Novus Analytics down on the ground floor. My lobby. I had designed that space myself. I chose the towering walls of reinforced glass, the polished slate floors, and the massive pillars of dark steel. The entire ground floor of the building was engineered to intimidate anyone who walked through the revolving doors. It was built to make visitors immediately understand that they were stepping into a fortress of immense wealth and untouchable power. And right now, sitting directly in the center of that fortress, looking incredibly small and entirely out of place, was my biological family. It had been precisely 15 years since I last saw them in person. 15 years since I sat shivering on a dark porch in suburban Portland, with my entire life packed into 2 black plastic garbage bags. Watching them now through the sterile lens of a security camera felt profoundly surreal. Time had aged my father Thomas. The broad shoulders that used to carry an air of absolute authority in our household now slumped beneath the crushing weight of his failing commercial real estate empire. He was wearing his best-tailored charcoal suit, but it hung loosely on his frame. It was a physical manifestation of the $50 million debt he carried. He paced the slate floor like a trapped animal, nervously checking his gold watch. He was completely unaware that the anonymous tech chief executive officer he was so desperate to meet was the exact same daughter he had thrown away like trash. My mother, Susan, sat perfectly upright on one of the imported leather sofas. She had always treated her public appearance like a weapon, and today in Seattle was no different. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her makeup was completely flawless, and her designer handbag was clutched tightly in her lap like a protective shield. But the high-definition cameras were unforgiving. They captured the fine lines of pure panic around her eyes and the tight, rigid set of her jaw. She was terrified. They were all terrified because their entire world was on the brink of total collapse. And then there was Chloe, my older sister, the golden child of the Sterling family who had never been told the word no in her entire 36 years of life. She was pacing near the front reception desk, wearing a pristine white silk blouse and tapping her manicured nails impatiently against her expensive phone. She looked exactly as I remembered her, beautiful, constantly irritated, and utterly consumed by her own entitlement. Standing right beside her was her husband, Julian. Julian was the slick, fast-talking finance broker who had managed to completely gut my father's company from the inside out in just 5 short years. He was the primary reason they were currently facing total financial ruin. Yet he stood there with his hands in his pockets, leaning casually against a steel pillar and exuding a nauseating level of unearned confidence. I reached forward and pressed a small button on the brushed aluminum control panel sitting on my desk. The audio feed from the lobby microphones instantly crackled to life, filling my quiet office with their voices. The sound of them hit me like a physical blow. It was a sudden and violent rush of the past colliding directly with the present. "You need to stop pacing right now," Thomas Julian was saying. His voice was smooth, patronizing, and dripping with the kind of arrogance only a man playing with someone else's money could possess. You're going to sweat completely through your suit before they even call us upstairs to the boardroom. You need to look like a man who is in control of his business, not a man who is begging for his life. My father stopped pacing near a modern water sculpture and turned to Julian. His face was pale and strained with exhaustion. How exactly am I supposed to look like I am in control, Julian? We are $50 million in the red. The bank sent the final foreclosure notices on Tuesday morning. We have less than a week before they seize the commercial properties, the house, the cars, everything we own. If this Novus Analytics executive decides to liquidate our debt instead of restructuring it, I am going to lose the company my grandfather built. I am going to lose absolutely everything. Julian let out a short, dismissive laugh that made my blood run cold. You are not going to lose anything, Tom. You just need to follow the script I gave you on the flight over here. These Silicon Valley tech billionaires are all exactly the same. They sit up in their glass towers running predictive algorithms, but they do not actually know how the real world works. They do not understand the art of the deal. They run their companies on raw data, but they buy into emotion. You are going to walk into that boardroom today, and you are going to sell them the legacy angle. What legacy angle? My father asked, his voice trembling slightly as he wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. They have our entire financial portfolio. They know we are failing. The numbers do not lie. They only know what the numbers say, Julian replied smoothly. He stepped closer to my father and lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, but the sensitive microphones picked up every single syllable. And numbers can be contextualized. We tell them that sterling real estate is a victim of sudden macroeconomic shifts, not bad management. We tell them that we are a deeply rooted traditional family business built on loyalty and mutual support. We sell them the image of the honest, hardworking American family that just needs a temporary lifeline to weather a difficult storm. You look that anonymous chief executive officer right in the eye, and you tell them that family values are the absolute core of our business model. You tell them we take care of our own, and that is why our company deserves to survive. Up in my penthouse, I gripped the edge of my desk so tightly my knuckles turned white. Family values, loyalty, mutual support. The sheer unadulterated hypocrisy of those words coming from their mouths made my stomach turn completely upside down. They were standing in the lobby of my building preparing to leverage the concept of family devotion as a bargaining chip to save themselves from a financial disaster they had created through pure greed. They were planning to preach about taking care of their own, entirely forgetting the daughter they had discarded the moment she became a financial inconvenience to their upper-class lifestyle. My mother chimed in then. Her voice carried that familiar sharp tone of absolute authority that used to make me shrink into myself when I was a teenager. Julian is exactly right, Thomas. You cannot walk in there looking defeated. We are the Sterling family. We have a reputation to uphold in this community, and we will not be humiliated. We just need to convince them to give us a 3-year grace period on the interest payments. Once the commercial real estate market bounces back, Julian can flip those retail spaces, and we will be fine. You just have to play the part of the devoted patriarch. Make them feel sorry for you. Make them respect you. Chloe sighed loudly, dramatically, throwing her hands up in the air and looking toward the ceiling. I cannot believe we are even in Seattle right now doing this, she complained. Her voice echoed shrilly in the cavernous lobby. Julian, you promised me we would be closing on the New Hampton summer house by next week. You promised me we were going to upgrade the country club membership so we could host the charity gala. Now I am standing in some sterile tech building begging a computer company not to take my house away. If my friends find out about this, I will be completely ruined socially. I will be an absolute laughingstock. Julian moved to Chloe's side and wrapped a reassuring arm around her shoulders. He kissed the side of her head, playing the role of the devoted husband perfectly for his audience of 2. Relax, babe, he murmured, projecting an aura of total control. I promise you we are not losing the house. We are not losing the country club. I have doctored the occupancy reports for the retail strip malls. I padded the projected revenue for the next 4 quarters so the margins look stable. When this tech nerd looks at our files, they will see a portfolio that is just temporarily underperforming, not a portfolio that is fundamentally dead. I have dealt with these people before. They are socially awkward shut-ins who hide behind computer screens and code. I will charm them, I will flash a few complicated financial terms to confuse them, and they will sign the restructuring agreement without ever looking closely at the fraudulent numbers. We will walk out of here with $50 million in breathing room, and they will never even know they got played. I stood completely frozen in my office. I was listening to the man who was actively destroying my family proudly confess to doctoring official financial reports and committing outright federal wire fraud. He was laying out his entire criminal strategy on a silver platter. He was entirely unaware that he was speaking directly into the high-definition security microphones of the most advanced financial risk assessment firm in the entire country. He thought he was so incredibly smart. He thought he was untouchable. He thought my company was run by a naive, gullible fool he could easily swindle with fake spreadsheets. But what was infinitely more sickening than Julian's blatant criminality was the reaction of my own parents. They did not reprimand him. They did not express shock or outrage that their son-in-law had falsified official commercial documents. They did not show an ounce of moral hesitation. Instead, my father visibly relaxed. His tense shoulders dropped as he absorbed Julian's criminal reassurances. My mother nodded approvingly, patting her designer handbag and offering Julian a small, grateful smile. They were perfectly willing to break the law. They were perfectly willing to lie, cheat, and steal to maintain their illusion of wealth and superiority. They were the exact same people they had been 15 years ago. Time had not softened them. Impending financial hardship had not humbled them. They were still driven by the exact same toxic vanity and ruthless self-interest that had allowed them to look a young teenager in the face and tell her she was nothing but a useless burden. Suddenly, the serene silence of my office was broken by a soft chime from my computer. I turned my attention to the large monitor on the left side of my desk. A new email had just bypassed my executive filters and landed directly in my private inbox. I walked over and looked at the screen. The sender address belonged to Thomas Sterling. He had sent an urgent message to the general contact address for the Novus Analytics Board of Directors. My internal routing system had immediately forwarded it to my secure terminal. I opened the email and began to read. Every single word was like a fresh insult. To the esteemed members of the Novus Analytics Board, the email began. My name is Thomas Sterling, and I am the founder of Sterling Real Estate. I am currently waiting in your lobby with my family to discuss the restructuring of our commercial debt. I am writing this personal appeal to ask for your grace and understanding before our formal meeting begins. I rested my hands on the edge of the desk, my eyes scanning the pathetic, groveling words. Our company is not just a business, my father wrote. It is a generational legacy built on the core principles of honesty, integrity, and absolute devotion to our people. We have faced unprecedented economic challenges this year, but we remain a strong and united front. The Sterling family operates on a strict code of traditional family values. We believe in mutual support. We believe in second chances. We take care of our own, and we never abandon those who depend on us. I am humbly asking you to look past the temporary financial difficulties on paper and see the strong moral foundation of our family. If you grant us this debt relief, I promise you will see the true meaning of Sterling family loyalty. I stared at the glowing screen, reading the final sentence over and over again. The true meaning of Sterling family loyalty. A wave of pure visceral disgust washed over me. It was so intense it made my hands shake. My father was actually using the concept of family loyalty as a shield to protect his fraudulent empire. He was sitting in my lobby right now, typing out a desperate manifesto about how the Sterling family never abandons those who depend on them. He wrote those words without a single ounce of shame. He wrote them completely, forgetting the 13-year-old girl he had thrown out into the freezing night because she needed a $15,000 medical surgery. He wrote about mutual support while actively protecting a son-in-law who was systematically robbing him blind. They were all completely delusional. They had lived inside their wealthy bubble of lies and manipulation for so long that they actually believed their own fabricated reality. They thought they could simply narrate their way out of a $50 million disaster by playing the role of the wholesome American family. I looked back at the security monitor. Down in the lobby, my father was putting his phone back into his pocket, taking a deep breath and trying to pull his shoulders back. He looked over at Susan and nodded, trying to project the image of a confident patriarch. Chloe was checking her reflection in a decorative mirror, fixing her lipstick. Julian was staring at the elevator banks, waiting impatiently to be summoned to his victory. They wanted a meeting with the board of directors. They wanted to negotiate with the anonymous chief executive officer. They wanted to test the limits of Sterling family loyalty. I decided right then and there to give them exactly what they asked for. I was going to tear down every single lie they had ever told. I was going to strip away their arrogant facades and expose the rotting core of their precious family values. And I was going to do it so thoroughly that they would never be able to look at themselves in a mirror again without remembering this exact day. I reached over and pressed the intercom button on my desk. Sarah, my executive assistant, answered immediately. "Yes, Madam CEO," she said, her voice calm and professional. "Sarah," I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured despite the storm of cold fury raging inside me. "The rehearsal period in the lobby is over. It is time. Please, go downstairs and collect the Sterling family. Escort them past security and bring them directly up to the VIP boardroom on the 50th floor." "Understood," she replied. "Would you like me to have the legal team present for the initial introductions?" "No," I said. My eyes locked on the monitor as Julian impatiently checked his watch again. "I do not want anyone else in that room. I want to meet with them alone first. Make sure the boardroom is fully prepared. Set out the financial dossiers, the foreclosure notices, and the doctored occupancy reports Julian submitted last week. Leave them right in the center of the table." "Of course," Madam CEO Sarah said. "I will bring them up immediately." I released the intercom button and stepped back from the desk. The quiet hum of the air conditioning was the only sound in the penthouse. I walked over to the small locked drawer on the right side of my desk and retrieved the digital audio recorder I had prepared for this exact occasion. It held the final devastating piece of evidence that would bring their entire world crashing down. I slipped the cold metal device into the pocket of my tailored jacket. I walked out of my office and headed down the long silent corridor toward the executive boardroom. The grand stage was fully set. The actors were stepping onto the elevator. The 15-year wait was finally over. The burden they had discarded was about to become their absolute ruin. The heavy double oak doors of the executive boardroom swung open with a quiet and solid thud. I was already seated at the far end of the massive mahogany table. I sat in a high-backed leather executive chair. I had intentionally turned my chair around to face the floor-to-ceiling glass windows looking out over the sprawling Seattle skyline. A thick gray fog rolled over the city streets below, hiding the ground from view, while a steady rain beat against the reinforced glass. I did not turn around when I heard them walk in. I kept my back completely facing them. I wanted them to feel the absolute power dynamic of the room before a single word was spoken. I wanted them to feel small. Sarah, my executive assistant, led them into the room. Her footsteps were quiet and professional against the thick, expensive carpet. Right behind her, I could hear the distinct, impatient clicking of Chloe wearing her expensive designer heels. I could hear Julian aggressively clearing his throat, attempting to clear the nervous tension from his chest. And I could hear the heavy shuffling steps of my father Thomas, taking what he assumed was his rightful place at the opposite end of the table. "Please make yourselves comfortable," Sarah said, her voice perfectly polite and entirely devoid of any emotion. "The chief executive officer will be with you shortly. Please lay out any physical materials you have brought for the review." I heard the soft click of the door closing as Sarah left the room. The four of them were now locked inside my private boardroom with me. I watched their faint reflections in the dark glass of the window. The lighting in the room was intentionally dimmed, creating a mirror effect on the rain-slicked windows. I could see their blurry outlines settling into the leather chairs. I could see Julian immediately opening his expensive leather briefcase. The sharp snap of the brass locks echoed loudly in the quiet room. Julian began placing the heavily doctored financial portfolios onto the polished wood table. I could hear the crisp slide of the thick paper folders. I already knew exactly what those folders contained. I had spent the entire morning reviewing the real numbers versus the fake numbers he had generated. He had brought beautifully bound reports filled with colorful graphs and completely fabricated revenue projections. He was laying out his trap completely unaware that he was building it inside a cage that had already been locked from the outside. I listened as they arranged themselves. My mother Susan let out a soft, impressed sigh. She was taking in the sheer wealth of the boardroom, the custom lighting, the imported wood, the absolute silence of the 50th floor. She loved money more than anything else in the world, and she was currently surrounded by more money than she had ever seen. She whispered something to Chloe about the quality of the leather chairs. Even now, on the absolute brink of total financial ruin, she was evaluating the furniture. Julian leaned over the table. He was whispering urgently to my father. "Remember what we discussed, Tom?" Julian hissed softly. "You lead with the family legacy. You make us sound like an American institution. Then you pass the conversation to me, and I will blind them with the market data. We just need to buy ourselves 36 months. Do not look desperate. You are Thomas Sterling. Act like it." I gripped the soft leather armrests of my chair. My fingernails dug deeply into the material. The sheer arrogance of this man standing in my building and coaching my father on how to commit corporate fraud was astounding. I kept my breathing slow and completely silent. I did not move a single muscle. To them, I was just a faceless tech billionaire, staring out the window, holding all the cards, and refusing to give them the courtesy of eye contact. I knew the silence was making them sweat. The power dynamic was entirely in my control. My father cleared his throat. It was a loud, booming sound that he used to demand attention at the dinner table when I was a child. He was trying to summon his old authority. He was trying to fill the massive, intimidating room with his presence. "Good afternoon." My father began, his voice projecting toward the back of my chair. "We deeply appreciate you taking the time to meet with us today on such short notice. I am Thomas Sterling, the founder and president of Sterling Commercial Real Estate. Sitting to my left is my beautiful wife of 40 years, Susan. To my right is my brilliant daughter, Chloe, and her husband, Julian, who serves as our chief financial director. We are the Sterling family." He paused, waiting for me to acknowledge them, waiting for me to spin my chair around and greet them. I did absolutely nothing. I remained perfectly still, watching the rain streak down the glass. The silence stretched out, becoming heavy and incredibly uncomfortable. I could hear Julian shifting nervously in his seat. The tactic was working perfectly. They were becoming desperate to fill the quiet void. My father cleared his throat again, his voice sounding slightly less confident this time. "We are here today to discuss the unfortunate circumstances surrounding our commercial debt portfolio." He continued, speaking to the back of my dark leather chair. "We understand that your firm recently acquired our loans from our previous banking partners. We also understand that you have issued a notice of immediate default and foreclosure. We believe this is a terrible misunderstanding of our actual financial health and our core business model." I listened to the smooth, practiced lie roll off his tongue. A terrible misunderstanding. That was how he categorized $50 million of stolen money and fraudulent accounting. Sterling Real Estate is not just a collection of properties, my father preached, his voice growing louder and more passionate as he settled into his rehearsed script. "We are a legacy. My grandfather started this company with nothing but a single building and a commitment to his community. We have survived recessions, we have survived market crashes, and we have survived by sticking to our traditional values. We are a family-run institution, and because we are a family, we operate differently than these cold, faceless corporate conglomerates. We operate on the principles of deep loyalty, unwavering integrity, and mutual support." The absolute hypocrisy of his words hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Deep loyalty, unwavering integrity, mutual support. He was throwing these words around as if they were holy scriptures. This was the exact same man who had looked me directly in the eye while I was standing on crutches, bleeding in the freezing snow, and told me I was dead weight. He had told me I provided zero value to his life. He had locked his front door and left me to freeze because I was an embarrassment to the wealthy people sitting in his living room. And now he was attempting to use the concept of family devotion to save his own skin. "We invest in people," my father continued, his voice dripping with fabricated sincerity. "We believe in taking care of our own. That is the secret to our longevity. When times get difficult, we do not run away. We close ranks. We support each other. We protect our blood. That is the Sterling way. And that is exactly how we treat our business partners. If you give us the grace period, we are requesting you will be gaining a partner who values loyalty above all else. You will be investing in a family that never abandons its responsibilities." I closed my eyes tight. The audacity was almost suffocating. He was painting a portrait of a loving, protective patriarch defending his flock. He actually believed his own narrative. He had completely erased me from his history. I was not a responsibility he had abandoned. I simply did not exist in his version of reality. I was a deleted file, a redacted chapter. He was sitting in my boardroom, surrounded by the empire I built from the ashes of his rejection, entirely convinced that he was an honorable man. Julian jumped in seamlessly, picking up the rehearsed routine exactly where my father left off. If I may add to that, Julian said, his voice dripping with that slick corporate charm I despised. Thomas has built an incredible foundation, but we are also a modern, forward-thinking company. I have laid out our updated financial portfolios directly in front of you. If you review the documents on the table, you will see that our current cash flow issues are strictly a temporary result of macroeconomic market shifts. We are simply experiencing a brief transitional dip due to external retail trends. I slowly opened my eyes and stared at their blurred reflections in the glass. A brief transitional dip. That was Julian explaining away millions of dollars funneled into a private shell company to buy a Hamptons beach house. If you look at page 4 of the executive summary, Julian continued confidently tapping the paper. You will see that our retail strip malls in the suburban sector are currently operating at a 94% occupancy rate. The projected revenue for the next 4 quarters shows a massive upward trajectory. The collateral holding your debt is rock solid. The banks panicked because they do not understand regional real estate dynamics. But we do. We know these markets intimately. We just need you to restructure the interest payments and extend the principal deadline by 36 months. In return, we are prepared to offer you a highly favorable interest yield that will guarantee your firm a massive profit. He was lying through his teeth. I knew for an absolute fact that those specific retail strip malls were completely empty. I knew the 94% occupancy rate was fabricated using ghost companies registered to Julian Personal Associates. I had the actual tax records sitting in a secure file on my desk. He was attempting to scam the chief executive officer of a risk assessment firm using the exact same elementary fraud tactics our software was designed to catch. He thought I was stupid. My mother spoke up next. Her voice was sweet and melodic, perfectly calibrated to sound like a reasonable, concerned mother asking for a simple favor. "We are just asking for a little bit of human compassion," she said softly. "My husband has worked his entire life to provide a beautiful life for our family. He's a good man, a generous man. He has given so much to the community and to our children. We are currently funding several major charitable initiatives back in Chicago. We just need a little breathing room so we can continue doing our good work. It would be a tragedy to let a proud family legacy be destroyed over a simple temporary spreadsheet error." A simple temporary spreadsheet error. My mother was calling $50 million of corporate theft a simple error. She was demanding compassion from a stranger after completely denying it to her own flesh and blood. She was asking for a bailout so she could maintain her country club status and her expensive charity galas. She was sitting there wearing thousands of dollars worth of designer clothing, begging for mercy because she could not fathom the idea of actually paying for her own mistakes. And then Chloe spoke. Her voice was laced with a thick layer of spoiled irritation that she was failing miserably to hide. "Frankly, we should not even be in this position," Chloe said loudly. "We have always paid our bills. Our family has a pristine reputation in Chicago. Everyone knows who we are. Everyone respects the sterling name. The banks were completely out of line selling our debt to a private equity firm without giving us a chance to negotiate first. It is bad business. We are offering you a very fair deal today. You really should take it before we decide to just take our business to a different lending institution entirely." I almost laughed out loud at the absolute absurdity of her threat. Chloe had absolutely no idea how finance worked. She thought she was shopping for a luxury handbag and could just threaten to leave the store if she did not get a discount. She was threatening a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm with taking her business elsewhere while her company was literally days away from total liquidation. She was completely untethered from reality. They were all completely untethered from reality. They were sitting in my boardroom, bouncing lies off each other, perfectly synchronized in their deception. They were a machine built entirely on fraud and vanity. They supported each other only in their mutual delusion. The pristine family reputation was a mask they wore to hide the rotting, decaying core of their shared greed. The air in the boardroom grew incredibly heavy. I had listened to enough. I had heard every single lie I needed to hear. The rehearsal was officially over. The fabricated pitch was complete. They had presented their fake numbers. They had preached their hypocritical family values. They had demanded respect. They had asked for compassion. They had laid all their cards on the table. It was finally time to show them mine. I took a deep, slow breath, filling my lungs with the cool air of the penthouse boardroom. I reached my hand into the pocket of my tailored suit jacket and closed my fingers tightly around the small cold metal of the digital audio recorder. I firmly pressed the play button, feeling a tiny vibration as the device activated. Then I slowly gripped the leather armrests of my executive chair. The room was completely silent, waiting for the anonymous billionaire to speak, waiting for the tech nerd to accept their fraudulent deal. I dug the heels of my shoes into the thick carpet, and I slowly, smoothly spun my chair around to face the massive mahogany table. I did not say a single word at first. I simply sat there in the dim lighting of the boardroom, completely still, letting my eyes lock directly onto my father's face across the length of the long wooden table. The physical reaction in the room was absolute, instant, and catastrophic. My father stopped breathing. His jaw went completely slack, dropping open as his eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror. All the color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in a charcoal suit. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles popped. My mother let out a sharp, strangled gasp. Her perfectly manicured hand flew up to cover her mouth, and her expensive designer handbag slid off her lap and crashed onto the floor. She stared at me as if she had just seen someone rise directly from the grave. Chloe blinked rapidly, her face twisting in violent confusion. She looked at me, then looked at my father, then looked back at me, unable to process the visual information in front of her. Julian just frowned, his arrogant smirk faltering slightly as he tried to figure out why his in-laws looked like they were having a simultaneous heart attack. I sat perfectly straight in my chair, projecting complete, absolute authority. I looked at the four of them, taking in their shock, their terror, their complete and utter paralysis. The power dynamic shifted permanently in that single fraction of a second. I was no longer the broken young woman crying in the snow. I was the executioner, and I held their entire existence in the palm of my hand. I reached into my pocket and placed the digital audio recorder right in the dead center of the polished mahogany table. "The charade ends right now," I said. My voice was dangerously calm, freezing the air in the room. "And the reckoning finally begins." I pushed the heel of my shoe into the thick, plush carpet of the executive boardroom and applied just enough pressure to turn my heavy leather chair. I did not rush the movement. I let the chair rotate in a slow and deliberate arc, forcing them to wait in the heavy silence, forcing the tension in the room to stretch until it was almost physically unbearable. The quiet hum of the building seemed to vanish entirely as I turned. When the chair finally locked into place, I was facing them directly across the expansive surface of the polished mahogany table. I folded my hands neatly in my lap, kept my posture perfectly straight, and simply looked at them. The silence that followed was not just quiet. It was a complete, suffocating vacuum that instantly sucked all the oxygen out of the room. My father, Thomas, was in the exact middle of taking a deep breath to continue his pathetic, rehearsed speech about family legacy. That breath caught sharply in his throat and stayed there. His broad shoulders, which he had just squared with such unearned arrogance a moment before, instantly collapsed inward. The color drained from his face so fast, it was as if a plug had been pulled, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His jaw literally fell slack. His eyes, those same cold, unforgiving eyes that had looked at me with absolute disgust on that freezing porch 15 years ago, were now wide with an entirely different emotion. It was pure, unadulterated terror. He stared at me like a man who had just watched a ghost walk directly through a solid wall. He tried to swallow, but his mouth was clearly bone dry. His hands, which had been resting confidently on the expensive leather binder he brought to scam me, began to shake uncontrollably. Right next to him, my sister Chloe physically recoiled. She threw her upper body violently backward against the high back of her imported chair, as if she had been slapped across the face. Her perfectly manicured hands flew up to grip the armrests, her painted fingernails digging desperately into the dark leather. The smug, entitled irritation that permanently lived on her features was completely wiped away, replaced by a look of sheer, uncomprehending shock. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a small, pathetic, choking sound escaped her throat. She looked at me, then looked at our father, then looked back at me, her brain utterly failing to process the visual information in front of her. Beside Chloe, my mother, Susan, was completely paralyzed. The woman who had spent her entire adult life treating her pristine public image as an impenetrable suit of armor was visibly crumbling before my eyes. Her flawless facade shattered into a million jagged pieces. She began to stammer a series of broken, nonsensical syllables, tumbling from her lips as her mind completely short-circuited. The useless, invisible daughter they had literally thrown away in black plastic garbage bags was sitting in the ultimate seat of power in a $2 billion empire staring back at them with eyes made of absolute ice. The only person in the room who did not immediately understand the catastrophic magnitude of the situation was Julian. He had married into the Sterling family years after I was discarded like broken furniture. He had never seen my face in person. He had only heard whispered, dismissive stories about the pathetic, estranged younger sister who was nothing but a financial drain and a burden. To Julian, I was just a stranger in a tailored navy blue suit sitting in the chief executive chair. He saw his in-laws having a simultaneous collective mental breakdown, but his slick Wall Street ego refused to let the silence sit. He assumed his family was simply intimidated by the corporate environment, and he assumed I was nothing more than an administrative hurdle standing in the way of his money. Julian forcefully cleared his throat, buttoning his expensive suit jacket and leaning forward aggressively over the table. He flashed me that slick, predatory smile he used to manipulate regional bank managers and naive investors. "Excuse me, miss," Julian said. His tone was dripping with thick, patronizing condescension. "I am not entirely sure what is happening with my family right now, but I believe we were scheduled to meet directly with the board of directors and the chief executive officer of Novus Analytics. We have a highly sensitive $50 million commercial portfolio to discuss today. We really do not have the time to sit here while the executive assistants do the preliminary screening. Please go fetch whoever is actually in charge of making the financial decisions in this building so we can get down to real business." I did not blink. I did not frown. I did not offer a single word of correction. I simply let his arrogant, foolish words hang in the sterile, chilled air of the boardroom. I wanted him to feel incredibly confident right before I tore the ground out from under his feet. My father finally managed to find a fractured, broken piece of his voice. "Julian," my father rasped, his voice trembling so violently he sounded like a very old, very sick man. "Julian, shut your mouth. Just shut your damn mouth right now." Julian looked at my father in utter bewilderment. "Tom, what is wrong with you?" Julian demanded, his voice rising in sharp irritation. "We are losing valuable time here. We need the actual decision makers in the room right now before the banks finalize the foreclosure." Exactly on cue, the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. David walked in. David was the brilliant software engineer who had partnered with me all those years ago in a freezing garage. He was the public face of Novus Analytics, the man who appeared on the cover of every major financial magazine, the man the entire banking industry believed was running the show. He was wearing his signature casual grey sweater and carrying a sleek digital tablet. Julian instantly recognized him from the magazine covers. Julian's face lit up with greedy, desperate relief. He immediately stood up from his chair, smoothing his silk tie, and enthusiastically reaching his hand out across the long mahogany table. "Mr. David Brooks," Julian announced, loudly projecting his voice across the room with manufactured confidence. "It is an absolute honor to finally meet you in person. I am Julian, the Chief Financial Director of Sterling Real Estate. We have prepared an incredible, mutually beneficial restructuring proposal for you today. If you will just take a look at these portfolios on the table, I can walk you through the margins." David did not even glance at Julian. He completely ignored the extended hand and the desperate corporate charm. David walked straight past the Sterling family as if they were entirely invisible, his eyes fixed exclusively on me. He stopped directly beside my high-backed leather chair, planting his feet firmly on the carpet and clasped his hands professionally behind his back. He bowed his head slightly in a gesture of profound, genuine respect that you cannot fake. "Madame CEO," David said clearly. His voice echoed perfectly in the quiet, expensive acoustics of the boardroom. The final acquisition transfer documents for the Sterling commercial debt portfolio have been fully processed by our legal department. The default is verified. They are completely ready for your final authorizing signature whenever you wish to execute the complete foreclosure of their assets. The words hit the room like a physical shockwave. Julian's extended hand slowly dropped to his side. The smug, confident smile melted off his face, instantly replaced by a sickening, horrifying realization. He looked at David, then slowly turned his head to look at me. His eyes darted frantically back and forth as his brain finally caught up to the terrifying reality of his situation. I was not the administrative assistant. I was not a junior executive sent to take notes. I was the anonymous creator. I was the billionaire. I was the absolute unquestioned authority in this building, and I held the legal deed to his entire fraudulent life. The heavy silence that followed David's announcement was completely suffocating. It was the kind of absolute ringing quiet that occurs right before a massive building collapses in on itself. I waited for the apologies to start. I waited for my father to drop his arrogant pride and beg for forgiveness. I waited for some sign of basic human remorse for the 15 years of pain isolation and medical debt they had forced upon me when I was just a child. But I had severely underestimated the bottomless depths of their toxic delusion. The silence was not broken by a tearful apology. It was broken by my mother. Susan suddenly stood up from her chair. I watched in absolute morbid disgust as she quickly smoothed down her designer skirt and actually forced a bright, sickeningly sweet smile onto her face. It was the exact same fabricated, glowing smile she used at her elite charity galas when she wanted to extract a donation from a wealthy patron. She completely ignored the crushing weight of her past cruelty and pivoted instantly to an alternate reality that served her current desperate financial needs. "Oh, sweetheart," my mother exclaimed. Her voice was practically vibrating with fake manufactured maternal warmth. "Claire, my darling girl, look at you. Just look at you. We had absolutely no idea. You are the chief executive officer of this incredible company." I sat completely frozen, staring at her as she actually took a step toward me. She was attempting to bridge the massive physical and emotional gap with a cheerful, upbeat tone, acting as if we were just having a pleasant family reunion at a coffee shop after a long vacation. "I always knew you were a genius, Claire," my mother continued, clasping her hands together tightly in front of her chest. "I told your father years ago. I said, our Claire is destined for truly great things. She just needed a little push to find her independence and spread her wings. And look what you have built. You are a billionaire. You bought our debt from those awful banks to save us. This is wonderful news. It is a true miracle. You saw that the banks were going to ruin our business, and you stepped in to protect the family legacy, just like we taught you." She took another step closer, her eyes gleaming with a predatory, desperate hunger that made my skin crawl. "I knew you would not let us lose our home, Claire. You are going to forgive those terrible bank loans, right? You are going to restructure everything for us so we can get back on our feet and beat this market. Because family takes care of family. That is what we have always believed. We take care of our own. We are so incredibly proud of you, sweetheart. Welcome back to the family." The sheer staggering audacity of her words felt like a physical assault. It was a level of toxic entitlement so deep, it bordered on sheer madness. My mother was actually trying to claim credit for my survival. She was looking me in the eye and calling the night they threw me out onto an icy porch to bleed the night they abandoned a terrified girl because she was a financial burden, a little push for independence. She was invoking the sacred word of family after completely erasing my existence for 15 painful years. She truly, deeply believed that a fake smile and a few hollow manipulative words of praise would magically erase the mountain of trauma she had buried me under. She thought she could just snap her fingers, play the role of the proud mother, and I would obediently fall right back into my old pathetic role as the reliable, invisible beast of burden. She expected me to sacrifice the empire I built with my own blood and sweat just to save their fraudulent country club lifestyle and keep her in designer clothes. A white, hot, blinding fury ignited deep in my chest. It was a cold, calculating anger that had been waiting 15 years in the dark to be unleashed. I did not raise my voice. I did not lose my professional composure. I simply placed my hands perfectly flat on the polished mahogany table and slowly, deliberately stood up from my executive chair. The simple, quiet movement completely shifted the gravity in the room. My mother stopped mid-step. Her fake, desperate smile faltered and began to slip as she looked into my eyes and finally realized there was absolutely zero forgiveness waiting for her in this room. I stood tall in my fortress of glass and steel, looking down at the four people who had tried to destroy me. The unbelievable charade was absolutely over. The time for listening to their fabricated lies and their toxic manipulation was permanently finished. I looked directly into my mother's eyes and watched the desperate hope completely drain away from her perfectly powdered face. "I am not forgiving your debt, Susan," I said. My voice was incredibly steady and completely devoid of the warmth she was so desperately trying to fake. "I am not restructuring your loans today. I am not giving you a 36-month grace period. You are going to pay back every single cent of the $50 million you owe, or I will personally authorize the complete liquidation of your entire commercial portfolio by the end of business on Monday." My mother physically recoiled as if I had reached across the mahogany table and slapped her. Her face twisted into a deeply ugly mask of pure indignation and toxic entitlement. She dropped the sweet maternal act in a fraction of a second. "You cannot do this to us!" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly against the glass walls of the boardroom. "We are your family. We raised you. We put a roof over your head for all those years. You owe us your life, Claire. You have to help your sister. Family takes care of family." "I owe you absolutely nothing," I replied calmly, refusing to break eye contact. "You made sure of that when you left me to freeze on your front porch because a hospital bill was too inconvenient for your social calendar. You wrote me off as a bad investment 15 years ago. This is simply the final return on that specific investment." That was when Julian decided to drop his fake corporate charm entirely. He realized his smooth talking was completely useless against a woman who held the actual deeds to his fraudulent life, so he pivoted immediately to the only other tactic he knew: vicious intimidation. Julian aggressively unbuttoned his expensive suit jacket, stood up completely straight, and let out a cold, sharp laugh. "Well, well, well," Julian said, shaking his head slowly. "This is quite the emotional family reunion. It really brings a tear to my eye. But let us put the pathetic family drama aside for a minute and talk about the actual law." He reached into his designer leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, dusty manila folder. He slapped it down hard onto the polished oak table. The sound cracked like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Do you recognize this document, Claire?" he asked. His lips curled into a vicious, triumphant sneer. "Because our legal team back in Chicago found this sitting in the bottom of an old filing cabinet just last week." I did not need to look closely at the faded parchment to know exactly what it was. It was a standard corporate, non-disclosure, and intellectual property agreement. It was the exact same piece of paper my father had forced me to sign when I was 22 years old, back when I was working 50 hours a week, doing his complicated commercial bookkeeping for absolute free. "Let me refresh your memory, since you seem to have forgotten your roots." Julian continued, tapping his finger aggressively against the old contract. "When you were employed by Sterling Real Estate, you signed a binding legal contract stating that any systems, algorithms, or financial processing methods you developed while working under our roof belonged entirely and exclusively to the company. You were an employee. We owned your labor. We owned your ideas." My father suddenly perked up. The color began to return to his pale face. He looked at Julian with sudden understanding, realizing the massive legal weapon they had just placed on the table. He immediately backed Julian up, his desperation turning into sheer malice. "That is exactly right," my father barked, his voice growing louder, dripping with renewed sickening confidence. "You developed your understanding of real estate data while looking at my books, Claire. You used my proprietary company information to build your little predictive risk software. You stole company secrets from your own family to build Novus Analytics. This entire company belongs to me." Julian leaned across the table, his eyes locked onto mine with pure malicious intent. "We are going to sue you in federal court, Claire," he stated flatly, pointing a finger at my face. "We are going to file a massive intellectual property lawsuit claiming that the core algorithm of Novus Analytics was stolen directly from Sterling Real Estate. We will drag your precious $2 billion company into a brutal, highly publicized legal battle that will last for years. We will freeze all your assets. We will subpoena every single line of code you have ever written. We will tell the financial press that the brilliant anonymous chief executive officer of Novus Analytics is actually a corporate thief who stole her own father's proprietary software." My mother chimed in, her voice shrill and completely devoid of any remaining pretense of maternal love. "You will lose absolutely everything, Claire. She threatened, her eyes wide with greedy anticipation. The big banks will drop your enterprise contracts the second a massive federal lawsuit is announced. Your board of directors will throw you out to protect their stock prices. We will absolutely destroy this company, and we will destroy your entire life if you do not sign over the rights to our debt right this second. Hand over the waivers, clear our $50 million balance, and give us a percentage of your equity, or we take your entire empire down to the ground. I stood there, in the absolute silence of the executive boardroom, looking at the three of them. My father, my mother, and the man who had hollowed out their legacy, all standing shoulder to shoulder, entirely united in their willingness to completely annihilate me, just to save their own vanity. They were actively threatening to burn down 15 years of my blood, sweat, and tears, based on a dusty piece of paper and a mountain of delusional lies. They thought they had finally outsmarted me. They thought they had backed me into a corner where my only option was total surrender. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I remained completely and utterly ice cold. You want to talk about stolen assets and federal lawsuits, Julian? I asked softly. My voice was dangerously quiet, forcing them to physically lean forward to hear me. You want to talk about taking millions of dollars that do not belong to you? I did not reach for the audio recorder I had brought from the lobby. Instead, I slowly reached down and opened the bottom drawer of my heavy oak desk. I pulled out a different digital voice recorder, a sleek silver device that my security team had handed to me earlier that morning. I set it gently on the table, directly in front of Julian. Julian scoffed, rolling his eyes in exaggerated disbelief. "What is this?" he demanded, crossing his arms over his chest. "Are you trying to record us threatening you? Go ahead. It is a civil business negotiation. You have absolutely nothing on me. I know exactly how to play this game." I did not say a single word. I simply reached out and pressed the glowing green play button. The boardroom was instantly filled with the sharp, clear sound of a telephone ringing. It was an intercepted audio recording. The call connected, and the sound of Julian's own voice echoed loudly from the tiny digital speaker. It was not his smooth public relations voice. It was his real voice. The hushed, panicked, and incredibly greedy tone he used when he thought no one else in the world was listening. The audio was crystal clear. It was intercepted directly from the prepaid burner phone he kept locked in a duffel bag at his exclusive country club. "Is the transfer complete?" Julian's voice demanded through the speaker, sounding breathless and urgent. A man with a heavy accent replied on the other end of the line. "Yes, Mr. Julian. The final wire transfer of $4.2 million just cleared the offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The money is completely secured and entirely untraceable. Sterling real estate is now completely drained of all liquid capital. The primary business accounts are entirely empty." I watched my father's face completely freeze. His eyes widened to an unnatural size as he stared down at the small silver device sitting on the table. The smug confidence evaporated from his features in an instant. "Perfect." Julian's voice replied on the recording, letting out a dark, deeply satisfied laugh. "Thomas has absolutely no idea what is happening. The old fool actually thinks we are just going through a temporary market dip. He trusts me blindly. I have doctored the quarterly spreadsheet so thoroughly he thinks the company is still holding strong retail assets. But what happens when the massive balloon payments default next week?" the man on the other end asked, sounding genuinely concerned. "The federal auditors are going to demand to see the commercial escrow accounts. They will see the money is missing. They will know someone embezzled the funds." "Let them look all they want," Julian sneered on the tape, his voice dripping with pure venom. "By the time the federal agents figure out that the escrow accounts are completely empty, I will be sitting on a private beach in the Caymans with Chloe. All the fraudulent loan documents, all the falsified occupancy reports, all the illegal offshore transfers, I deliberately forged Thomas's signature on every single primary authorization form over the last 3 years. When the Securities and Exchange Commission comes knocking with federal arrest warrants, they are going to arrest Thomas immediately. He is the registered owner. He is going to take the entire fall for the missing $50 million. The old man is going to die in a federal penitentiary, and I am going to walk away completely clean with his family fortune securely locked in an offshore vault." I reached out and calmly pressed the stop button. The heavy, suffocating silence slammed back into the boardroom with the force of a physical blow. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The air in the room became so incredibly dense, it felt like trying to breathe underwater. My father slowly, agonizingly turned his head to look at Julian. His hands began to shake violently, knocking against the edge of the mahogany table. The realization of what he had just heard was crashing down on him like a collapsing concrete building. The son-in-law he had fiercely protected, the man he had chosen over his own daughter, had systematically robbed him blind. Julian had deliberately bankrupted his legacy, drained his life savings, and meticulously framed him for massive federal financial crimes. Julian had actively planned to send him to a federal prison to die so he could steal the family wealth. Julian's face was no longer pale. It was a terrifying, sickly shade of translucent gray. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly like a fish suffocating on dry land. He looked wildly around the room, completely trapped, absolutely destroyed. The extreme arrogance was completely gone, replaced by the raw animalistic terror of a man who suddenly realized he was going to spend the next 20 years of his life in a concrete cell. Thomas, Julian stammered, holding his hands up defensively and physically backing away from the table. Tom, listen to me right now. That is not what it sounds like. That audio is fabricated. It is a deep fake. She faked it. Claire faked the audio using artificial intelligence to divide us. You cannot believe her. She just wants to destroy the family. My father did not say a word. He just stared at Julian with a look of pure, unadulterated murder. The absolute betrayal in his eyes was profound. The legacy he had bragged about was nothing but a hollow shell completely gutted by the very man standing next to him. You were going to run away to the Caymans, Chloe suddenly shrieked. Her voice hit a pitch that physically hurt my ears. She lunged forward, her hands curling into tight fists. You told me we were buying a new luxury house in the Hamptons next month. You stole my father's money, and you were going to leave him to go to jail while we hid on an island. You lied to me. Susan let out a horrifying guttural wail and collapsed back into her imported leather chair, clutching her chest as if she were having a massive heart attack. Her perfect, pristine world was completely incinerated in less than 2 minutes. The family loyalty they had just preached about so passionately in my lobby was exposed as a complete and total illusion. They were a pack of rabid wolves, and they had just discovered they were entirely surrounded by their own kind. I stood at the head of the table, watching the absolute destruction of the Sterling family empire unfold in real time. I felt no pity. I felt no sadness. I felt absolutely nothing but a clean, cold sense of pure justice. The invisible daughter they had thrown out into the freezing night had finally brought the storm directly inside their perfectly manicured house. The recording clicked off. The tiny green light on the digital device faded into black, but the horrific echo of Julian plotting to destroy my father lingered heavily in the chilled air of the executive boardroom. The silence that followed was not just quiet. It was a suffocating vacuum that instantly sucked all the oxygen out of the room. I stood at the head of the long mahogany table, perfectly still, watching the shockwave of absolute devastation tear through the people who had once thrown me away like garbage. Chloe was the first person to physically break. The pristine mask she had worn for 36 years shattered into 1,000 pieces. She let out a scream that did not even sound human. It was a raw, guttural screech of pure rage and total humiliation. She launched herself across the leather chair, her manicured hands curling into claws as she lunged at the man she had married. "You lying parasite!" She shrieked, her voice echoing violently against the thick glass walls of the penthouse. "You told me we were moving to the Hamptons. You told me we were upgrading the country club membership for the summer gala. You were going to steal my family money and leave us to rot in federal court while you hid on an island." Julian stumbled backward, tripping clumsily over the heavy steel legs of his executive chair. He held his hands up in front of his face, completely terrified of the woman he had spent the last 5 years manipulating. "Chloe, please, you have to listen to me right now," Julian stammered. His slick corporate voice was completely gone, replaced entirely by the pathetic, high-pitched whine of a cornered rat. "That recording is a fake. She fabricated it to tear us apart. You know how much I love you. We are a team. We are partners in this business. Do not ever touch me again," Chloe screamed, batting his hands away as if his skin were covered in a deadly disease. She turned her wild, tear-streaked face toward my father. "Dad, do something. He's trying to steal absolutely everything we own. Tell him it is a lie. Tell him you are not going to let him do this to us." But my father could not speak a single word. Thomas Sterling, the man who had ruled our childhood home with an iron fist, the man who had looked me directly in the eye when I was a bleeding, terrified 24-year-old and told me I was dead weight, was currently clutching the left side of his chest with a violently trembling hand. His face had turned a horrifying shade of translucent grey. He was gasping for air, his chest heaving irregularly as he collapsed heavily back into his leather chair. He was not having a physical heart attack, though the panic in his wide eyes suggested he thought he was. He was experiencing the complete catastrophic death of his massive ego. I watched him stare at Julian. He was looking at the golden boy he had welcomed into the family with open arms. He had given Julian the absolute keys to the kingdom. He had handed over the company bank accounts, the private financial ledgers, and the generational legacy he so proudly preached about. He had trusted a smooth-talking con artist implicitly simply because Julian wore an expensive tailored suit and knew how to play golf at the right clubs. Then slowly, agonizingly, my father turned his heavy head to look at me. The realization was physically crushing him. He looked at the daughter he had discarded on an icy porch 10 years ago. He looked at the woman who had spent her youth silently balancing his books, fixing his careless mathematical errors, and keeping his aging company afloat for absolutely free. He finally understood the cosmic justice of the moment. The golden son-in-law had deliberately orchestrated his complete financial ruin, actively planning to flee to a tropical island while leaving him to face a brutal federal prison sentence. And the invisible, useless daughter was the billionaire holding the definitive proof. The daughter he threw away was the only person who had ever actually worked to save his company from early bankruptcy. My mother, Susan, was completely paralyzed by the revelation. She sat rigidly in her chair, her eyes wide and entirely vacant, her hands trembling violently in her lap. Her entire reality was based on social hierarchy and perceived wealth. Without those superficial things, she was absolutely nothing. She could not comprehend a world where her precious country club friends discovered her son-in-law was a federal embezzler and her pristine family was completely destitute. Julian realized that his family shield was entirely gone. He turned his desperate, panicked eyes back to me. "Claire, listen to reason," he begged, his voice dropping into a frantic, hushed whisper as he leaned over the mahogany table. "We can make a deal. You are a businesswoman. I am a businessman. I have access to millions of dollars in secure offshore accounts. I can wire you a massive percentage right now. We can split the remaining assets evenly. Just delete that recording and let me walk out of this building. Nobody else ever has to know about this. I will sign whatever non-disclosure agreements you want." I looked at him with absolute freezing disgust. "You really do not understand where you are. Do you, Julian?" I said, my voice cutting through the chaotic room with razor-sharp precision. "You think this is a corporate negotiation? You think I brought you up to the 50th floor to haggle over stolen money like a common street thief?" I reached down to the polished surface of my desk and calmly pressed the small silver button on my communication console. "Send them in," I said clearly into the microphone. Julian froze completely. "What did you just do?" he asked, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy double doors of the boardroom. "What does that mean?" "You are incredibly arrogant, Julian," I told him, folding my arms tightly across my chest. "You thought you were the smartest person in the room because you knew how to forge a signature and open a hidden bank account in the Cayman Islands. But you forgot that every digital transaction leaves a permanent footprint. You forgot that you were routing those fraudulent transfers through the very same megabanks that utilized Novus Analytics software. I did not just intercept a burner phone call. I mapped your entire criminal enterprise. I have the exact routing numbers. I have the fake lease agreements. I have the IP addresses of the illegal shell companies you created. And I forwarded all of it to the federal authorities 6 hours before you ever stepped foot inside my lobby." The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open with a loud, forceful crash. A team of federal agents stepped rapidly into the room. They were not private security guards. They were official investigators from the Securities and Exchange Commission, flanked immediately by 3 armed federal marshals wearing dark tactical vests. The sheer physical presence of federal law enforcement instantly sucked all the remaining air out of the room. Julian Sterling, the lead federal marshal, announced, stepping forward with absolute authority. His hand hovered instinctively near his duty belt. Julian backed away from the table, his hands raised high in the air. "Wait!" he stammered, his voice cracking into a high pitch. Wait, there is a massive misunderstanding here. I am just the chief financial director. I was strictly acting on the direct orders of the company president. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my father. Thomas Sterling authorized every single transfer. His signature is on all the primary documents. He is the one you want. My father let out a choked, horrifying sound of pure betrayal. He stared at Julian, the man he had trusted over his own flesh and blood, watching him instantly try to throw an old man under the federal bus to save his own skin. We have already reviewed the digital evidence provided by Novus Analytics, the lead investigator said, coldly, completely ignoring Julian and his pathetic attempt to shift the blame. We have undeniable proof of extensive digital forgery, intentional wire fraud, and severe corporate embezzlement. 2 federal marshals stepped quickly around the mahogany table. They grabbed Julian by his expensive tailored arms, spinning him around forcefully and slamming his hands behind his back. The sharp, heavy click of metal handcuffs echoing in the silent boardroom was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Julian began to weep loudly. The slick, confident finance broker completely disintegrated into a sobbing, terrified child. He twisted his head to look at Chloe, tears streaming down his flushed face. Chloe, please, call my lawyer, he begged, his voice raw with pure panic. Call the firm back in Chicago. Tell them I need immediate representation. Tell them I am being framed by this company. Please, babe, do not let them take me away. Chloe stared at him with absolute venomous hatred. She slowly stood up from her chair, smoothing down the front of her white silk blouse. She looked at the man she had married, the man who was supposed to guarantee her a life of unimaginable luxury and status. I hope you rot in a federal prison cell. Julian, she said, her voice dripping with pure ice. I am filing for divorce the second I leave this building. The marshals did not hesitate or wait for another word. They marched Julian toward the heavy double doors. He was crying openly, dragging his expensive leather shoes across the thick carpet, begging anyone in the room to help him. I watched him go, feeling absolutely nothing but a clean, cold sense of finality. The doors closed firmly behind him, cutting off his pathetic sobs, leaving only my biological family remaining in the room. The energy in the boardroom was completely obliterated. The grand, arrogant facade of the Sterling family had been entirely dismantled in less than 20 minutes. My father was still slumped deeply in his chair, staring blankly at the empty space where his son-in-law had just been arrested. His chest was rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. The business his grandfather had built, the legacy he had prioritized over his own daughter and her life, was completely gone. It was not just bankrupt. It was a designated federal crime scene. My mother slowly turned her head to look at me. Her face was streaked with running mascara, her perfect blonde hair slightly disheveled from the shock. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. She finally realized that the pleasant, forgiving daughter she had tried to summon a few minutes ago simply did not exist. Claire, my mother whispered, her voice shaking uncontrollably. Claire, what is going to happen to us now? We have absolutely nothing to do with what Julian did. You have to believe us. We did not know he was stealing the money. We are innocent in all of this. I know you did not know about the embezzlement, Susan, I replied calmly, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of sympathy. You were entirely too obsessed with planning country club galas and spending money to ever actually look at the balance sheets. And Thomas was entirely too arrogant to believe anyone could ever pull the wool over his eyes. You are not criminal masterminds. You are just incredibly lazy and profoundly entitled. I reached into the thick leather folder sitting on my desk and pulled out a stack of crisp, legally binding documents. I walked slowly around the massive mahogany table, my footsteps silent on the carpet, until I was standing directly in front of my parents. I slid the thick stack of papers across the polished wood until they rested directly under my father and his trembling hands. What is this? My father asked, staring at the documents as if they were covered in lethal venom. Those are the finalized, perfectly legal foreclosure execution documents, I explained, looking down at him with an unwavering gaze. As I stated previously, Julian completely drained the primary accounts of Sterling Real Estate. The business is totally insolvent because you personally guaranteed those massive commercial loans to fund your extravagant lifestyle. Your personal assets are now entirely forfeit. I own the debt. I own the commercial properties. And as of this morning, I officially own the title to your estate in Chicago. My mother let out a sharp, devastated gasp, covering her mouth with both trembling hands. Our home, she sobbed, fresh tears spilling rapidly down her cheeks. You are taking our home away. Claire, you cannot do this. I planted the rose gardens in that yard. We raised you in that house. You raised me to believe that love is a conditional transaction. I corrected her, my voice turning to absolute stone. You raised me to believe that if I could not provide financial value to your vanity, I deserved to be thrown out into the freezing snow with my belongings in garbage bags. You locked the door on a bleeding 24-year-old girl because she was a temporary embarrassment to your social circle. You taught me the rules of this family very clearly, Susan. I am simply following them to the letter. I tapped the top page of the foreclosure document. You have exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises. I told them, my words sharp and completely unforgiving. You will pack your personal clothing and leave the property. The vehicles belong to the estate. The furniture belongs to the estate. The country club memberships have already been cancelled due to non-payment. You are leaving with exactly what you gave me 10 years ago. Absolutely nothing. Chloe stood up, her face red with furious indignation. You are a monster, Claire, she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. You are a vindictive, hateful monster. We are your family. How can you sleep at night knowing you are making your own parents homeless? I sleep beautifully in a penthouse that I bought with my own money, Chloe, I replied, not breaking eye contact with my older sister. You have spent your entire 36 years on this earth, functioning as a parasite, living off money you never earned, and treating everyone around you like garbage. It is time for you to finally enter the real world. I suggest you start looking for a minimum wage job, because the Wall Street trust fund you were relying on just walked out the door in federal handcuffs. I turned back to my father. He was staring down at the foreclosure papers, tears silently falling onto the crisp white pages. The great Thomas Sterling completely broken, completely defeated by the very daughter he had deemed worthless. You can leave now, I told them, stepping back and gesturing toward the heavy double doors. Security will escort you out of the building. Do not ever attempt to contact me again. If you try to reach out, if you try to challenge this in court, I will personally ensure that every single detail of Julian and his embezzlement and your profound negligence is leaked to every major newspaper in Chicago. You will not only be broke, you will be a complete public disgrace. My father slowly pushed himself up from the chair. He looked incredibly old, his shoulders hunched, his hands shaking as he buttoned his suit jacket. He did not look at me. He could not meet my eyes. He turned and slowly began to walk toward the door, a broken patriarch leaving his shattered kingdom. My mother scrambled to pick up her designer handbag from the floor, her hands fumbling blindly. She looked at me one last time, her face twisted in a mixture of pure terror and profound, undeniable loss. She finally realized the absolute finality of her choices. She followed my father out the door, her expensive heels dragging heavily on the carpet. Chloe was the last to leave. She glared at me, her eyes filled with toxic, helpless rage, but she had absolutely no words left. She turned and stomped out of the boardroom, following her ruined parents into the cold reality of their new lives. I stood alone in the center of the executive boardroom, listening to the soft click of the heavy oak doors closing. The room was entirely silent again. The rain continued to beat steadily against the floor-to-ceiling windows, washing over the dark glass. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the clean, cool air fill my lungs. I looked around the room at the expensive leather chairs, the polished mahogany, the towering view of the city. I had built this empire from nothing. I had survived the freezing cold. I had survived the crushing debt. And today, I had finally severed the last toxic anchor holding me to a past that had never truly wanted me. The execution was complete. The past was permanently buried. I turned and walked toward the door, ready to step back into the incredible life I had built entirely on my own terms. If you have ever been the invisible child, the one expected to sacrifice everything for people who offer nothing in return, I want you to know that your value is not determined by their cruelty. You hold the power to build your own empire, brick by brick, far away from their toxic shadow. Please drop a comment with your city and the time you are watching this video, so I know you stand with me. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and never let anyone tell you that you are a burden. You are the architect of your own future. I walked slowly across the thick carpet of the empty executive boardroom until I reached the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows. The heavy rain was still beating against the glass. I placed my hand against the cold pane and looked down at the streets 50 stories below. Through the thick fog and driving rain, I could clearly see the bright flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers parked directly outside my building. I watched the tiny figures of the armed federal marshals aggressively pushing a heavily handcuffed Julian into the back of a large black government vehicle. A few moments later, two more small figures emerged from the revolving glass doors. It was my father, Thomas, and my mother, Susan. They had no umbrellas. They had no luxury cars waiting for them in the loading zone. They simply stepped out onto the wet pavement. They stood there shivering in the freezing downpour, completely stripped of their vast wealth, their fake social status, and their toxic pride. They were finally experiencing the exact same cold, absolute isolation they had forced upon me 15 years ago. I expected to feel a massive surge of vindication. I expected to feel the fiery rush of triumphant revenge that I had dreamed about when I was a terrified teenager freezing on their front porch. But as I watched the police cruisers pull away from the curb and merge into the busy city traffic, I felt absolutely none of those things. There was no vicious joy in my chest. There was no gloating satisfaction in my heart. Instead, there was only a profound, incredibly deep sense of peaceful silence. The heavy, suffocating anchor that I had been dragging behind me for my entire adult life had finally been cut loose. The toxic tie was completely and permanently severed. I did not destroy the Sterling family. I simply handed them the mirror they had been avoiding for decades and allowed them to destroy themselves. For 15 years, the word burden had haunted my every waking moment. When my father looked me in the eye and told me I was useless deadweight, he planted a seed of doubt that almost consumed my entire existence. I spent the first few years of my independence desperately trying to prove that I was valuable. I worked 80-hour weeks. I built algorithms in a freezing garage. I skipped meals so I could afford server space to run my predictive risk models. I thought I was doing all of that to show my parents they had made a terrible mistake. I thought my massive financial empire was built on the foundation of proving them wrong. But standing in the absolute silence of my own 50-story building, I finally realized the complete truth. Being labeled a burden and being violently thrown out into the cold was not a curse. It was the greatest gift my parents could have ever given me. If they had kept me inside their beautiful, wealthy mansion, I would have spent my entire life shrinking myself down to fit into their incredibly narrow expectations. I would have spent decades doing their complicated mathematical accounting for absolutely free just to earn a tiny scrap of fabricated affection. I would have been a permanent prisoner to their conditional love and their toxic vanity. By throwing me away, they accidentally set me completely free. They forced me to realize that I was the only person in the entire world who was responsible for my survival. I had absolutely no safety net to catch me if I failed. I had to build my armor brick by brick and dollar by dollar. And in that desperate struggle for pure survival, I discovered exactly how much power I truly possessed. The only people who were ever actually holding me back were the people who were supposed to love me the most. They wanted me to be weak because it made them feel strong. They needed me to be a failure so they could justify their own moral bankruptcy. The people who call you a burden are almost always the exact same people who are secretly relying on you to carry their dead weight. My parents preached about traditional family values and unshakable loyalty, but they were completely hollow inside. They used the concept of family as a weapon to manipulate and control everyone around them. They demanded absolute devotion while offering absolutely nothing but cruelty in return. You cannot negotiate with people who operate in that kind of toxic delusion. You cannot earn their respect by working harder or giving them more of your money. You can only survive them by walking away entirely and refusing to ever look back. I turned away from the cold glass windows and looked at the beautiful empty boardroom. Tomorrow, I would have my legal team finish the complete liquidation of Sterling commercial real estate. The mansion in Chicago would be sold to the highest bidder. Every single remaining asset would be stripped away and sold to recover the stolen $50 million. My parents would have to learn how to survive in the exact same harsh, unforgiving reality they had forced me to navigate when I was just a child. I walked over to the table and picked up the digital audio recorder. It was a tiny piece of plastic and metal, but it held the definitive truth that had set me permanently free. Boundaries are not about revenge, they are about survival. If you are breaking your back to carry people who would not lift a single finger to save you, put them down. You owe them nothing. Thank you for listening to my story. Do you think I should have given my parents a second chance, or did they get exactly what they deserved? Let me know in the comments. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more stories about claiming your worth. Take care of yourself.